The squeak started 4 months before Claire Morrison ever rolled through Grayson Hale's door. It began as a whisper metal against metal in the right rear, bearing the kind of sound you convince yourself isn't really there until it becomes the only thing you hear. By the time she dragged her custom racing chair through 7 different garages across southern Idaho, the whisper had become a scream, and Claire had learned something she wished she could unlearn. Most people see a wheelchair the way they see a stop sign, an obstacle, a problem that isn't theirs to solve. The first garage told her they didn't work on medical equipment. The second said they couldn't source the parts. The third took one look at the titanium frame and quoted her $800 for a bearing replacement any bike shop could do for 40. She left. The fourth actually tried, but the mechanic stripped the axle bolts so badly she had to use a backup chair for 3 days, while a machinist friend fabricated a replacement. The fifth charged her $240, tightened everything with an impact wrench set too high, and handed back a chair that pulled so hard to the right she developed tendinitis in her left wrist, compensating for it over the next 6 weeks. The sixth garage was run by a man who looked at her with the particular species of pity she'd come to recognize in the years since the accident, the kind that made her feel like she was supposed to thank him just for acknowledging her existence. He told her she should really just get a new chair. Something motorized, maybe something that wouldn't give her so much trouble. She asked him if he told every customer with a squeaky brake pad to buy a new car. He didn't have an answer for that. By the time Claire found Hale's garage and machine works tucked between a feed store and an abandoned railroad depot on the eastern edge of Meridian, Idaho, she'd stopped expecting anything. The building was small brick, older than most of the strip malls that had grown up around it like weeds. A hand-painted sign hung above the bay door, white letters gone gray with road dust: Hale's Auto and Industrial Repair. Below it in smaller letters someone had added more recently, precision work, fair prices, no rush jobs. The last part almost made her turn around. She didn't have time for no rush jobs. The manuscript was due in 6 weeks. The publisher wanted the author photo by Monday. She had an interview with a podcast in Boise tomorrow, and the highway between here and there was all rough asphalt and potholes deep enough to swallow a wheel. But the right rear bearing was grinding, now actually grinding. And if it seized while she was doing 45 on State Route 84, she'd flip the chair, probably break something important, definitely miss the interview, and possibly end up in another emergency room explaining to another nurse that, yes, she knew it was dangerous. Yes, she'd been meaning to get it fixed. No, she didn't have anyone who could drive her places. She pushed through the side door instead of the main bay. The shop was dim and smelled like motor oil and cutting fluid, and something else, something sharper. Ozone, maybe. Welding. The space was organized with the kind of precision that made Claire immediately trust whoever ran it. Tools hung on shadow boards where their outlines were painted on the wall. Parts bins labeled in careful block print. A workbench that looked like it had been built sometime during the Eisenhower administration, worn smooth by decades of use, but clean, not a single bolt out of place. A man was bent over something mechanical on the far bench shoulders, hunched, completely absorbed. He didn't look up when she came in. Claire had learned not to announce herself immediately. People reacted differently when they saw the chair first versus when they saw her first. Sometimes it was better to be a voice before you were a person in a wheelchair. Sometimes it didn't matter at all. She waited. The man worked. She could see his hands moving with the unhurried precision of someone who'd done the same motion 10,000 times and knew exactly how much pressure to apply, where the resistance would come from, when to stop before something broke. He was older than her by a few years, maybe late 30s. Dark hair going gray at the temples. Wearing a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled up forearms, corded with the kind of muscle you got from actually using tools instead of a gym. There was a quietness to the way he moved that reminded Claire of the way her mother used to paint that complete focus where the rest of the world just stopped existing. The mechanical thing he was working on revealed itself slowly. A fuel injection manifold disassembled with each component laid out in the exact order it would need to be reassembled. He lifted one piece, examined it against the light from the window, set it down, picked up a tiny wire brush, cleaned something Claire couldn't see from where she was set the brush, down exactly where he'd picked it up from. She cleared her throat. He didn't startle. His hands just stopped moving. He set down the manifold component with the same careful precision, wiped his fingers on a shop rag, and turned around. His eyes went to her face, first held there for exactly 1 second, then dropped to the chair with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating a machine, not a person. He looked at the right rear wheel, the left front, the anti-tip casters, the frame wells back up to her face. "We close in 15 minutes, he said. His voice was quiet, not unfriendly, just factual, stating information. "I know. I'm sorry. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't—" The squeak cut her off. She'd barely moved, just shifted her weight to reach for the brake, and the right rear bearing let out a sound like a dying animal. Metal on metal, grinding, the kind of noise that made everyone in a 5-foot radius wince. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He looked at the wheel again, differently this time. Then he looked at her hands, at the way her left wrist was wrapped in a compression bandage she'd been wearing for 6 weeks straight, at the way her right hand was gripping the push rim a little too tight. "How long's it been making that sound?" "4 months. It started quiet." "And nobody's fixed it?" Claire almost laughed. "I've been to 7 shops. 2 wouldn't touch it. 3 couldn't figure it out. 1 made it worse. 1 told me to buy a new chair." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then what did the one who made it worse do?" "Used an impact wrench on the axle bolts. Stripped 2 of them. Over-tightened everything else. The chair's been pulling right ever since." The man walked toward her, not fast, and crouched down to eye level with the right rear wheel. He didn't ask permission to touch the chair. Most people did in that performative way that was more about making themselves feel good than actually respecting her space. He just looked first, then reached out and put one hand on the wheel rim, barely touching it, and spun it slowly. The squeak became a grind, became something that sounded like it might actually seize mid-rotation. He stopped, let the wheel coast backwards, listened to something Claire couldn't hear. Spun it again, this time watching the axle instead of the rim. His jaw tightened. "Your bearings shot. Both rear bearings, actually, and your axle's bent." He stood up, walked around to the other side, crouched again. "Anti-tip wheel on this side is mounted at the wrong angle. See that?" He pointed to something Claire couldn't quite make out from above. "Bracket's about 4 degrees off. Probably a factory defect. Been there since you got the chair, I'd guess." 6 years, Claire said quietly. He looked up at her. Really looked the kind of looking that made Claire want to check if she had something on her face. She didn't. He was just seeing her. The compression wrap on her wrist. The way she was sitting slightly forward and to the left to compensate for the pull. The particular set of her shoulders that came from pushing uphill for 6 years with equipment that was fighting her every inch. 6 years you've been pushing harder than you should have needed to because nobody caught a 4-degree angle on a mounting bracket. It wasn't a question. Claire nodded anyway. He stood up, wiped his hands on the shop rag again, even though they weren't dirty, and looked at the clock on the wall. 4:48. She'd already taken up 3 of his last 15 minutes. She waited for him to say what everyone always said. "Come back tomorrow. Come back Monday. Come back when we're not about to close." Instead, he walked to the bay door and hit a button. The overhead door rumbled shut with a finality that made Claire's stomach drop a little. He turned back to her. "I've got to pick my daughter up from school at 6. That gives me about an hour and 10 minutes. He gestured toward a lift platform in the corner, the kind shops use to raise motorcycles for service. "If I can get you over there and get this thing apart, I can tell you what's actually wrong and whether I can fix it tonight or if you'll need to come back." Claire had learned to be suspicious of men who offered to help her. Not because they were all bad, but because the ones who were bad often hid behind the offer. But this man wasn't offering to help her. He was offering to fix her chair. There was a difference. "What if you can't fix it tonight? Then I'll tell you that, and you can decide if you want to come back or try shop number 8. Do you know how to work on wheelchairs?" "No." He said it without hesitation. "But I know how bearings work. I know what a bent axle looks like. I know when something's mounted wrong. Your chair's just a machine. Machines are machines." Claire had been told that before, but never quite like this. Never with the quiet confidence of someone who actually believed it instead of someone trying to convince themselves they could wing it. She looked at the shadow boards on the wall, at the precision of the organized parts bins, at the fuel injection manifold laid out in perfect disassembly order on the bench. "Okay," she said. He nodded once, went to get something from a cabinet, came back with a clean furniture pad, and spread it on the lift platform. Then he looked at her and stopped, hands in his pockets, waiting. Understanding without having to ask that she'd transfer herself, that she didn't need his hands on her, that the chair was a tool she operated, and he was there to fix the tool, not manage the operator. Claire transferred. He lifted the chair onto the platform as easily as if it weighed nothing, which it didn't really. 15 pounds of titanium and aluminum and rubber. Lighter than most bikes, the chair just carried the weight of everything people projected onto it. He raised the platform until the chair was at a comfortable working height and started disassembling it with the same systematic precision he'd used on the fuel injection manifold. Right rear wheel first. Axle, bolt lock, washer, spacer bearing, race. Each component removed, carefully examined, set down in order on a clean shop towel. He didn't talk while he worked. Claire watched from the padded stool he'd pulled over for her. After a few minutes, she realized he'd positioned it so she could see exactly what he was doing, so the work wasn't happening to her equipment behind her back. The right rear bearing came out in pieces, literally. The cage had fractured and 3 of the ball bearings had escaped entirely, leaving the remainder to grind themselves and the race into metal dust over the course of 4 months. The man set the destroyed bearing down on the shop towel and moved to the left rear without comment. That one was almost as bad, not fractured yet, but close. The balls had worn flat spots you could see with the naked eye. He set it next to its twin, moved to the anti-tip wheel, removed it entirely, held the mounting bracket up to the light. See this? He angled it so Claire could see the bolt holes. These are slotted, should be round. Someone drilled them out, slotted, so the bracket could be adjusted, probably to correct a frame tolerance issue during manufacturing. But then they mounted it at an angle and nobody ever corrected it. He looked at her. Every time you go over uneven ground, your center of gravity shifts about an inch rearward from where it should be. Your body's been compensating with forward lean for 6 years. That's why your lower back hurts. Claire hadn't mentioned her lower back. She'd stopped mentioning it 3 years ago when the 4th physical therapist told her it was probably just part of her new normal, something she'd have to learn to live with. Chronic pain, they called it. Manage it with stretching and anti-inflammatories and maybe acupuncture if she wanted to try alternative medicine. How did you, the way you're sitting, the way you transferred, you didn't arch your back at all. Most people do little bit, just the natural motion. You kept it completely flat. That's compensating. He set the bracket down. It's not in your head. It's a 4-degree angle that's been wrong for 6 years. Something happened in Claire's chest. Not quite crying, not quite something else. A feeling like a fist unclenching around her lungs. She'd been told so many times that the pain was her fault. She wasn't stretching enough, wasn't doing her PT exercises, wasn't accepting her limitations, wasn't trying hard enough, was trying too hard. Never once had anyone suggested that maybe possibly the equipment was wrong. The man was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not curiosity. Something closer to recognition, like he'd seen this exact moment before from a different angle. "What's your name?" she asked. "Grayson." He picked up the fractured bearing again. "Grayson Hale. This is my shop. I'm Claire. Claire Morrison." "I know. You wrote it on the intake sheet." He gestured toward a clipboard hanging by the door, where she'd filled out the standard form while waiting. "I read everything. Even the part where I wrote, 'Please actually fix it this time,' under special instructions. Especially that part." He set the bearing down and checked the clock. 5:04. He had 56 minutes left. "I've got the bearings. SKF precision grade, better than the originals. I can turn a new axle on the lathe out of chromoly rod stock, harder than what you've got now. And I can correct the anti-tip bracket angle." He paused. "But all of that's going to take about 3 hours, which means you'll have to come back, or I can do a temporary fix right now that'll get you mobile, and you can bring it back tomorrow." "What's the temporary fix?" "I've got one good bearing that'll fit the left rear. I can install that and remove the right rear wheel entirely. Move the left rear to right rear position, adjust the frame stops so you're not dragging. You'd be pushing a 3-wheeled chair, but it wouldn't be pulling and it wouldn't grind." He looked at her directly. "It's not what I'd recommend, but it's what I can do in the next 50 minutes. What do you recommend?" "Leave it here tonight. I'll fix it properly." Pick it up tomorrow. He must have seen something shift in her face because he added, I've got a loaner. It's not pretty and it's not fitted to you, but it's functional and it won't break down between here and wherever you're staying. Claire thought about the hotel 6 blocks away. Thought about the podcast interview tomorrow that she'd need to get to the 70-mile drive to Boise on questionable highway. Thought about trusting her only means of independent mobility to a man she'd met 17 minutes ago in a shop she'd found by accident. How much? She asked. Grayson looked at the destroyed bearing at the bent axle at the mounting bracket. Bearings are 40 each. Axle material is 12. Mounting hardware is negligible. Labor's 60 an hour, figure 3 hours, that's 180. Call it 270 total. $270, $30 more than the shop that had made it worse. But this man had diagnosed in 5 minutes what 7 other people had either missed or ignored, and he'd done it by actually looking instead of making assumptions. The guy who charged me $240? Claire said slowly, I don't think he even removed the wheels. He just tightened everything from the outside. I believe that. Grayson picked up a bolt from the parts laid out on the shop towel. This lock washer's been over-torqued. See how it's compressed flat? That's not thread locker. That's someone with an impact wrench who didn't know what they were doing. There was no judgment in his voice. Just observation, stating facts. But Claire felt something shift anyway, some piece of the last 4 months clicking into a different configuration. It wasn't her fault. The equipment had been wrong. The people who tried to fix it had been wrong. She'd been right to keep looking, right to be frustrated, right to feel like something was off even when everyone told her everything was fine, or at least fine enough. Fix it, she said. Properly. I'll take the loaner. Grayson nodded and went to get the loaner chair from a back room. It was as promised, not pretty. Older model, probably hospital surplus, with the kind of weight that made Claire's custom titanium chair feel like air. But it was clean, and the wheels rolled true, and when Grayson handed it to her, he'd already adjusted the footrests to approximately the right height without asking her measurements. She transferred, pushed a few feet, felt the difference immediately. The chair was sluggish compared to hers, heavy in a way that would make her shoulders tired by the end of the day. But it didn't pull. It didn't grind. It just rolled, the way things were supposed to. Here, Grayson handed her a card. Not a business card, an actual index card with his cell number written in neat block print and the shop's address. If you have any issues with the loaner, call. If not, come by tomorrow after 4. I should be done by then. Claire looked at the card at the number at the man standing in his shop, surrounded by shadow boards and precision tools, and a half-disassembled wheelchair that 7 other people had failed to fix properly. Why are you being this kind to me? The question came out before she could stop it. Not suspicious exactly, just genuinely bewildered. People were nice, sure, but this was different. This was seeing what was actually wrong instead of seeing what was easy to fix. Grayson looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the destroyed bearing on the shop towel, at the bent axle at the mounting bracket, with its slotted holes that had been wrong since the day the chair was built. My dad used to say that the way a man treats something that doesn't have a voice is the truest measure of him. He picked up the bearing, turned it over in his palm. Your chair doesn't have a voice, but you do. And you've been saying something's wrong for 4 months and 7 people didn't listen. He set the bearing down and looked at her again. I listened, that's all. Claire left with the loaner chair and the index card and a feeling in her chest like something that had been locked for a very long time was starting to remember what a door felt like. She made it 6 blocks to her hotel before she had to stop and sit in the parking lot for 20 minutes, just breathing, just letting the weight of the last 4 months settle into something that wasn't her fault. The next morning, she drove to Boise for the podcast interview. The loaner chair was heavy and awkward, but it didn't fight her. She made it there and back without incident, without pain, without the constant mental calculation of whether she had enough strength left in her left wrist to compensate for the rightward pull. On the way back, she stopped at a coffee shop she'd wanted to try for months, but had avoided because the entrance had a slight incline, and her chair had been pulling too hard to trust it. The loaner was heavy enough that momentum actually helped. She made it up the ramp, ordered coffee, sat at a table by the window, and opened her laptop and wrote 4 pages of the final chapter she'd been stalled on for 3 weeks. A mechanic with quiet hands had fixed her chair. That wasn't the important part. The important part was that he'd believed her when she said it was broken. When Claire returned to Hale's garage at 4:17 the next afternoon, Grayson was exactly where she'd left him, at the same workbench, working on something else mechanical with the same systematic precision. This time he looked up when she came in. No smile, just a nod of acknowledgement. He wiped his hands and gestured toward the lift platform where her chair sat fully assembled, gleaming slightly in the afternoon light coming through the window. She transferred from the loaner. The moment her hands touched the push rims, she felt the difference. Not just the absence of the pull, not just the silence where the grind had been. Something deeper. The chair felt like an extension of her body again, instead of something she was constantly fighting. She pushed forward, did a full rotation, stopped. Perfect. Completely, absolutely perfect. "What did you do?" she asked. Grayson walked over, gestured to the rear wheels. "Precision bearing sealed cartridge type. They'll last longer than the originals and they run smoother. New chromoly axle hardened and ground straight to within 1/1000th of an inch. Corrected the anti-tip bracket angle and replaced the slotted bolt holes with proper round ones, used thread-locking compound so they won't drift. Retensioned all the frame bolts to spec. Lubricated the wheel hubs with marine-grade grease. It'll hold up better if you're outside a lot." "Hey, how did you know I'm outside a lot?" "Your wheels have trail debris in the tread. Gravel mostly. Some pine needles. You're not just going from parking lot to building. You're on trails." Claire had been a nature writer before the accident. After the accident, she'd convinced herself she'd have to switch to something else, something more accessible, something that could be done from a desk. For 6 years, she'd been trying to write about the outdoors from memory, from photographs, from the safety of places with smooth pavement and automatic doors. It had been killing her in ways she'd stopped admitting to herself. "I used to be," she said quietly. "I'm trying to get back to it." Grayson nodded like this made perfect sense. "The rail system I added should help with that." "Rail system?" He pointed to the right side of the chair. Claire looked down and saw it for the first time, a low-profile aluminum track running from just below the push handle down to the frame support above the wheel, with 2 adjustable clips spaced along its length. The metal was brushed aluminum light enough to barely add any weight, integrated into the frame so smoothly it looked like it had always been there. "For carrying things," Grayson said. "Laptop, books, whatever you need when you're on rough ground. Keeps the weight off your lap so your hands are free for pushing. The clips adjust for different widths. I based the dimensions on the laptop bag you brought yesterday." Claire hadn't brought a laptop bag yesterday. She'd brought her whole life in a backpack that she'd had to drape across her lap while pushing because there was nowhere else to put it. Except Grayson had seen it, had noticed the problem she'd stopped noticing because it had become part of the furniture of her daily existence and had built a solution out of aluminum and attention. She reached out and touched the rail. The metal was cool and smooth under her fingers. The clips moved easily, locked securely. It was beautiful in the way good tools were beautiful, purely functional, no wasted material, solving a problem with the minimum necessary intervention. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." Grayson picked up a small zippered pouch from the workbench and handed it to her. "Spare bearings. 2 full sets. The specs are written on the card inside so you can order more yourself if you ever need them. The bearings are SKF 6203-2RS standard size. Any decent bearing supplier will have them." Claire opened the pouch. Inside were the bearings carefully wrapped and a folded index card with bearing specifications written in the same neat block print as his phone number. At the bottom, he'd added, "If the wheels feel rough again, don't wait 4 months. Come back." "How much do I owe you?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer he'd given her yesterday. $270 for the repair work. The rail's on the house." "Grayson, you already paid $240 to someone who made it worse. Consider the rail an apology from the industry." Claire looked at him. He was already turning away, going back to his workbench, done with the conversation, in the way some people were done when they'd said what needed saying and saw no reason to decorate it further. She watched him pick up whatever mechanical thing he'd been working on. When she arrived, settled back into that focused quiet. "I'll be back," she said. He glanced up. "If something breaks..." "No." She touched the rail again, the smooth aluminum warm now from her hand. "Just to say thank you. Properly." "Once is enough," Grayson said. But there was something in his voice that wasn't quite dismissal, more like he'd heard people say they'd be back before, and had learned not to expect it, had learned that most thank yous ended at the door. He went back to his work. Claire paid the $270 in cash transferred back to her chair. Her chair fixed properly, fixed better than it had been in 6 years, and pushed herself out into the afternoon light. The chair rolled like a dream, silent, true, responsive to the smallest shift of her weight. Claire pushed herself in a slow circle in the parking lot just to feel it, the way the titanium frame flexed exactly right, the way the bearings made no sound at all, the way she didn't have to compensate or calculate or fight. She could just move. She made it halfway to her car before the tears came. Not sad tears, not happy tears exactly. Something more complicated. Relief, maybe. Or grief for the 4 months she'd lost the 6 years before, that all the miles she'd pushed with equipment that was fighting her, and a body she'd been told to accept was just going to hurt. The tears came hard enough that she had to stop, had to just sit there in the parking lot of a garage in Meridian, Idaho, and let it out where nobody would see. Except someone did see. When Claire finally looked up, there was a girl watching her from the side door of the shop. 9 years old, maybe 10, with dark hair and a ponytail, and serious eyes that didn't look away when Claire made eye contact. The girl was holding a backpack and a math textbook and studying Claire with the kind of direct curiosity kids had before adults taught them to look away from anything uncomfortable. "Are you okay?" the girl asked. Claire wiped her face. Yeah, I'm okay. My dad fixed your chair." "He did. He did a really good job. He fixes everything good." The girl said this with absolute conviction, the way kids stated facts about their parents. She shifted the backpack on her shoulder. "I'm Ren. I'm Claire. Why were you crying if he fixed it good?" There was no accusation in the question, just genuine interest. Claire took a breath, decided to tell the truth. Because sometimes when something's been broken for a long time, and then someone fixes it the right way, it makes you realize how broken it actually was. And that's a lot to feel all at once. Ren considered this with the seriousness of someone much older than 9. Like when my dad cries sometimes at night, it's not because he's sad right then, it's because he remembers being sad before. Claire didn't know what to say to that. Before she could figure it out, Grayson appeared in the doorway, behind Ren, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He looked at Claire, at his daughter, back to Claire. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, some subtle stiffening. "Ren, inside. We talked about this." "I was just saying hi." Ren turned to her father. "She was crying because you fixed her chair really good, and it made her feel a lot at once. That's okay, right?" Grayson looked at Claire again. Their eyes met. She couldn't read his expression, but she thought maybe he understood the way he'd understood about the wrist and the back and the 4-degree angle. That sometimes fixing something mechanical meant breaking something open in the person who'd been living with it, broken. "That's okay," he said quietly. Then to Ren, "Car, now. We're late for piano." Ren rolled her eyes in the way 9-year-olds did when parents stated obvious things, waved at Claire, and headed for a truck parked on the far side of the lot. Grayson stayed in the doorway a moment longer. "You get where you need to go, okay?" he asked. Yes, everything's perfect. Thank you." He nodded once and turned to go. Claire almost let him. Then she thought about the rail he'd built without being asked, about the spare bearings he'd packaged with specifications so she could maintain her own equipment, about the way he'd listened when 7 other people hadn't, and she made a decision that would change the shape of the next year of her life. "Grayson." He stopped, turned back. "What time do you close on Tuesdays?" Something very small shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise. More like he'd heard a sound he hadn't expected but recognized anyway. 6:30. "Why? I'll be back next Tuesday. 2 o'clock if that works. Not because anything's broken. I just..." She stopped, started again. "I write, and sometimes it helps to write somewhere that isn't where I live. Somewhere with people working, good people doing good work." Grayson was quiet for a long moment. Claire couldn't tell if she'd overstepped, if she'd misread whatever had passed between them in the moment he'd diagnosed her chair's problems, like they were the most important thing in his afternoon. Then he said, "Coffee's terrible, and I won't be much for conversation." "That's fine. I don't need conversation. I just need..." She gestured at the shop, at the shadow boards and the organized tools, and the sense of order that came from someone who understood that precision mattered. This, Tuesday at 2, Grayson said. Not quite a question, not quite agreement, just stating a fact, testing the shape of it. If it's not a bother, it's not a bother. He said it simply the way he said everything. No decoration, no performance, just the truth spoken plainly. Then he got in his truck with his daughter and drove away, leaving Claire alone in the parking lot with a chair that finally worked and a feeling that she just found something she hadn't known she was looking for. She didn't go back to the hotel. She drove to the trailhead on the south edge of town, the one with the gravel path she'd been avoiding for months because her chair couldn't handle it. The path led 3 miles into scrub pine and sage climbing, gradually toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. She'd hiked it 100 times before the accident. She hadn't been back since. The chair with its precision bearings and corrected anti-tip brackets and marine-grade grease rolled over gravel like it was paved. Claire pushed herself up the incline that would have been impossible yesterday, felt her shoulders burn in the good way, the way that meant she was doing something instead of compensating for something. At the top of the ridge, she stopped and looked out over the valley as the sun dropped toward the western mountains, turning everything golden and long-shadowed. She pulled out her phone and took 6 photographs. Not for Instagram, not for the book, just for herself. Evidence that she'd been here, that the world was still accessible if the tools were right. That night in her hotel room, Claire opened her laptop and wrote the first clean draft of Chapter 12, the chapter she'd been stalled on for 3 weeks. It was about the difference between accepting limitations and accepting equipment failure. About the radical act of believing yourself when everyone else told you the problem was you. About a mechanic in Idaho who'd looked at a wheelchair and seen a machine that wasn't working instead of a person who needed to adjust their expectations. She didn't use Grayson's name. She didn't describe the shop. But she wrote about what it felt like when someone finally listened and the words came easier than they had in months. By the time she looked up, it was past midnight, and she had 17 pages, and her coffee had gone cold, and she felt more like herself than she had since before her mother died. Tuesday came. Claire showed up at Hale's garage at exactly 2 o'clock with her laptop and a coffee she'd bought 2 blocks away because Grayson had warned her his was terrible. He was at the same workbench working on something that looked like a transmission, and he glanced up when she came in, nodded, went back to work. That was it. No greeting, no small talk, no performance of welcome. Claire found a stool in the corner with good light, set up her laptop, and wrote for 3 hours while Grayson disassembled and diagnosed and reassembled things mechanical. He made coffee once around 3:30 and brought her a cup without asking if she wanted one. It was as promised terrible. Burnt and weak at the same time, the kind of coffee that came from a machine that needed descaling and grounds that had been open too long. Claire drank it anyway. Something about the badness of it felt important, like Grayson had told her the truth about something small and unimportant, and that meant he'd probably tell her the truth about things that mattered. At 5 o'clock, a truck pulled in for an oil change. Grayson did the work in 20 minutes, charged the customer $35, and went back to the transmission. At 5:45, Wren arrived, dropped off by an older woman in a sedan, who waved at Grayson through the window but didn't come in. Wren dumped her backpack in the corner opposite Claire, pulled out a math workbook, and started doing homework with the same focused quiet her father brought to mechanical problems. Claire worked until 6:15, then packed up her laptop. Grayson was elbow deep in the transmission and didn't look up, but he said, "Same time next week," as she was heading for the door. If that's okay, wouldn't have asked if it wasn't. The next Tuesday she came back, and the Tuesday after that. By the 4th week, it stopped being a question and became a fact, like the shadow boards on the wall or the coffee that never got better. Claire would arrive at 2 with her laptop. Grayson would nod, and they'd exist in the same space for 3 or 4 hours without needing to fill it with anything but work. She learned things about him in small pieces, the way you learned about people who didn't offer information but didn't hide it either. That his daughter had been born with a heart defect and had needed surgery when she was 3, that the scar under her shirt was from a sternotomy that had saved her life but left her parents terrified every time she ran too hard or got too excited. That his wife had died 3 years ago in a car accident on the way to the hospital when Wren's heart had been acting up, that she'd been driving too fast in the rain, and the truck that ran the red light hadn't seen her until it was too late. That Grayson had been an aerospace engineer before, had designed components for commercial aircraft, had quit the week after the funeral because he couldn't make himself care about whether a turbine blade had the right tolerances when his wife was dead and his daughter's heart was still questionable, and the future he'd been building had collapsed into just trying to get through each day. She learned this over weeks, not all at once. A comment Wren made about her mom. A customer who mentioned they were sorry about Sarah. The way Grayson's hands would stop moving sometimes when he was working on something delicate, and he'd just stand there holding a tool looking at nothing for 5 or 10 seconds before he came back to himself and continued. Claire told him things too, though neither of them called it talking. Just information that came up naturally. That she'd been a travel writer before the accident, that she'd made a living going to difficult places and writing about them with the particular eye of someone who noticed the small, true things instead of the tourist version. That her mother had been a painter, landscapes mostly, and had died 6 months after Claire's accident from a stroke nobody saw coming. That they'd been in the middle of Claire learning to walk again with braces, and it had felt like the universe taking something back, saying you can have your legs or you can have your mother, but not both choose. That she'd chosen the wheelchair in the end because the braces hurt too much and took too much energy and left her too exhausted to do anything but survive. And at least with the chair she could work, could write, could move through the world even if it was different than how she'd moved before. Grayson listened the way he looked at mechanical problems, with complete attention and no judgment, and the understanding that sometimes things broke in ways that weren't anyone's fault, and the only thing you could do was describe the problem accurately and figure out what could still be fixed. On the 7th Tuesday, Claire brought her manuscript. Not to work on it, she'd finished it the week before and sent it to her editor, just to show him. She didn't say she was going to show him. She just pulled it out of her bag when he brought her the terrible coffee and set it on the workbench between them. "This is the book," she said, "the one I've been writing here." Grayson looked at the stack of paper at the title page. "Living Sideways 6 years after the fall." He glanced at her. "That what happened? You felt medi car accident. But yeah, the falling part was the memorable bit. 40 feet down an embankment after a semi clipped my rear bumper on the interstate. I don't remember much after the first roll. And you've been writing about it. About what came after. About learning to live in a body that works differently. About the wheelchair being a tool instead of a tragedy." She paused. "About the last 6 years. And about this summer. This summer made it into the book, the last chapter." Claire opened the manuscript to the final pages. "It's about a mechanic who fixed my chair when 7 other people couldn't. Who saw what was actually wrong instead of what he expected to be wrong. Who built something I didn't ask for because he was paying attention." Grayson read in silence. She watched his face looking for some reaction, but he had the same expression he had when he was diagnosing a transmission-focused absorbing information processing. When he finished, he set the pages down carefully and looked at her for a long moment. "You made me sound better than I am," he said finally. "I described what happened. You described it like it meant something." "It did mean something?" Claire touched the edge of the manuscript. "I've been stuck for 3 years. Not just physically. Stuck in the story of what I lost. And then you fixed my chair and I realized I'd been blaming my body for what was an equipment problem. And if I'd been wrong about that, maybe I was wrong about other things too." Grayson was quiet. "Then what else were you wrong about?" "That being in a wheelchair meant I couldn't do the work I used to do. That I had to become a different kind of writer because my body changed. That accepting my limitations meant accepting that the world was smaller now. And now I think the world was exactly the same size. I just had broken equipment." She closed the manuscript. "I'm going back to travel writing. Real travel, writing the kind where you actually go places and do things, and write about what it's like. My publisher wants to send me to national parks next spring. All-terrain wheelchair accessible trails, backcountry permits the real thing." Something shifted in Grayson's expression. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more complicated. "Because your chair works. Because my chair works. Because someone fixed it right. Because I stopped accepting broken as normal." He looked at the manuscript again. "You're going to publish this. That's the plan. It comes out next summer. And the chapter about me? The chapter about a mechanic who listened. Your name's not in it. Neither is the shop's. Just the idea that sometimes the thing you think is your limitation is actually just a thing that's broken and nobody's fixed it yet. Grayson picked up the pages again, read through the last chapter more slowly this time. Claire waited. She hadn't shown him to ask permission. The chapter was already written, already approved by her editor. She'd shown him because it felt important that he know what he'd done, not just mechanically, but in the larger sense. That fixing her chair had been the first domino in a line that ended with her getting her career back. When he finished reading the second time, he set the pages down and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he did something she'd never seen him do in 7 weeks. He smiled. Not big, just a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, but real. Good wood, he said. Claire blinked. What? Something my dad used to say? When you built something that mattered, something that would last, you used good wood. Didn't matter if it was a table or a house or a reputation. You started with good materials and you didn't cut corners. He tapped the manuscript. This is good wood. Claire felt something warm spread through her chest. It wasn't the first compliment she'd gotten on the book. Her editor loved it. Her agent had cried reading chapter 9. But this was different. This was recognition from someone who understood building things to last, who knew the difference between doing something fast and doing it right. Thank you, she said quietly. You're welcome. Grayson stood up, went back to his workbench, picked up the tools he'd set down when she arrived. Same time next Tuesday. Yeah, same time. But that Tuesday, Claire didn't come to write. She came to show Grayson something she'd never shown anyone else, something she'd kept locked in a storage unit since her mother died, because she hadn't known what else to do with it. She pushed through the door at 2 o'clock, pulling a small trailer behind her wheelchair, the kind cyclists use for cargo, and Grayson looked up from the engine he was rebuilding with an expression that might have been surprise if his face did surprise. Need help with something? He asked. No, I brought you something. To say thank you properly. You already said thank you. I said thank you with words. This is different. Claire unstrapped the bungee cords holding the cargo box closed and pulled out a painting wrapped in protective paper. She unwrapped it carefully. The painting was small, maybe 16 by 20 inches, in an old wooden frame that had been painted white sometime in the previous century. The image itself was a garage lit from within, with the warm golden glow of work lights spilling out onto concrete at dusk. Grayson came closer, looked at the painting without touching it. Claire watched his face. My mother painted this, she said. 30 years ago, before I was born. She used to drive around taking photographs of places she wanted to paint, and this was one of them. Some garage in Portland. I don't even know if it still exists, but she painted it because she said it looked like a place where important work happened. Why are you giving it to me? Because that's what your shop is, a place where important work happens. Work that changes things. Claire turned the painting so the light hit it better. And because you built something for me without asking for anything. The rail. So this is the thing I'm building for you without asking. Grayson looked at the painting for a long time. Then he looked at her. Your mother painted this. Yeah. And she's gone. Yeah. So this is the only one you have of this image. It's the only one anyone has. She didn't make prints. Each painting was singular. Grayson shook his head slowly. I can't take this. You can. You are. I'm giving it to you. Claire. Grayson. She held his gaze. You gave me my life back. Let me give you one painting. He was quiet for a moment. Then, it should be you giving me the painting, not her memory. What do you mean? This is beautiful, and I can see why it matters to you. But it's not yours, it's hers. If you want to give me something you made. Claire felt the words hit like cold water. I'm not a painter. You're a writer, same thing. You make pictures with words instead of paint. He touched the edge of the frame carefully. This belongs somewhere you can see it, where it reminds you of her. My shop's a good place, but it's not the right place for this. I don't have anywhere to put it. I live in hotels half the year, and the other half I'm in a place that doesn't feel like home. Grayson looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the back office and came out with a small key. He led her through the shop to a door she'd never been through, unlocked it. Behind the door was a storage room that had been converted into something else. A daybed against one wall, a small desk under a window, bookshelves, a kitchen corner with a coffee maker that looked better than the one in the shop. The space was Spartan but clean organized with the same precision as the garage. A place where someone lived who didn't need much but took care of what they had. "You live here?" Claire asked. "Above the shop, technically. That's where Ren and I sleep. This is where I go when I can't sleep, and I don't want to wake her." He gestured to the walls. They were empty except for a single photograph of a woman holding a small child, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "Your painting should go somewhere you can see it. This room's here whenever you need it. The key's yours." Claire looked at the room at Grayson at the painting in her hands. "You're giving me a room? I'm giving you access to a room that's mostly empty anyway. You said you don't have anywhere to put the painting. Now you do." He paused. "And if you're going to travel for work next year, you'll need a place to come back to that isn't a hotel. Somewhere to write between trips. Grayson, I can't just... It's a room above a garage. I'm not giving you a house. And if it bothers you that much, pay rent. $50 a month covers the electric and internet." He looked at her steadily. "You made this shop a place you wanted to come to on Tuesdays. Maybe it can be a place you actually stay sometimes." Claire opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Why?" "Because Ren likes you, and because I'm tired of working alone." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a proposition. It was Grayson Hale stating a simple fact: the shop was quieter when other people were in it doing their own work, and if she needed a place to exist between travels and he had space going unused, the math was obvious. "Okay," Claire said finally. $50 a month. Tuesday's still free," he added. "That's separate." Claire smiled despite herself. "Tuesday's still free." She hung the painting on the wall that evening above the desk, where the afternoon light would hit it just right. Then she sat in the room for 2 hours, doing nothing but looking at it, at the warm light spilling from the painted garage, at the sense her mother had captured of a place where work mattered. When she finally left to go back to her hotel, Grayson was locking up the shop. He handed her the key without comment. $50, she said, pulling bills from her wallet. "First of the month," he replied. "It's only the 17th. Consider it early." He took the money pocketed. It locked the door. They stood in the parking lot in the cooling evening air. Claire realized this was the longest they'd been outside together in neutral space that wasn't the shop or her hotel or anywhere with defined boundaries. "Thank you," she said, "for the room, for everything." Grayson looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first day, seeing her clearly, without pity or performance. Just seeing. "Same time next Tuesday," he said. Then he got in his truck and drove away, leaving Claire with a key to a room above a garage in Idaho and the strange, warm feeling that she'd just been given something much bigger than square footage. The room above the garage became Claire's in increments, so small she didn't notice the accumulation until it was too late to call it temporary. First the painting, then a change of clothes in the closet for days when writing ran long, and the drive back to her hotel felt like an interruption. A toothbrush in the bathroom. Coffee she preferred in the cabinet next to Grayson's terrible grounds. Books on the shelf that weren't hers when she arrived but became hers through the act of finishing them in that specific chair by that specific window. By the end of October, she was spending 3 nights a week there, writing until 2 or 3 in the morning with the kind of focus that only came in spaces that demanded nothing from her. The room asked for no performance of gratitude, no explanation of why she needed it. It simply existed, available with a key that fit the lock and a man downstairs who never questioned whether she'd be there or wouldn't. The Tuesdays continued. 2 o'clock, terrible coffee Claire at her laptop and Grayson at his workbench, and Ren in the corner doing homework that was getting noticeably harder as 4th grade progressed into territory that required understanding fractions and long division. Sometimes Ren would ask Claire for help, not because Grayson couldn't explain it, but because Claire explained math like it was a story problem with characters you could care about, and somehow that made the numbers cooperate better. If you have 3/5 of a pizza and you need to split it with 2 friends, what does each person get? Ren chewed her pencil. Who ordered the pizza? Does it matter? Yeah, because if I ordered it, I should get more. Claire laughed despite herself. That's not how math works. That's how pizza works. From the workbench, Grayson's voice cut through without him looking up from the carburetor he was cleaning. Each person gets 1/5. Show your work. Ren grumbled but wrote out the division. Claire went back to her manuscript, the new one she'd started the week after finishing the first. This one wasn't memoir. This one was about accessible wilderness, about the gap between what the Park Service claimed was wheelchair-friendly and what actually existed on the ground when you showed up with a chair that wasn't motorized and trails that were rated accessible for people who'd never actually tried to push 20 miles of gravel in 100-degree heat. The research was going to require travel. Real travel, the kind that meant leaving Idaho for weeks at a time, starting in the spring. Claire had been planning the route, marking parks on a map, contacting rangers and accessibility coordinators, and adaptive sports organizations that might have information about terrain. The project excited her in a way nothing had excited her since before the accident, but it also meant leaving the room above the garage, leaving the Tuesdays, leaving the strange, small life she'd built in the margins of Grayson Hale's systematic world. She hadn't told him yet, hadn't found the right moment, or maybe hadn't wanted to find it. The manuscript deadline wasn't until June. She had time, except time had a way of collapsing when you weren't watching it carefully. The publisher called on a Thursday in early November, with news that Living Sideways had been selected for early review by 3 major newspapers, and they wanted to move the publication date up from June to February to capitalize on the momentum, which meant Claire needed the author photo by the end of the month and the final marketing materials by the 15th. And oh, by the way, could she be available for a book tour in March? Nothing major, just 8 cities in 2 weeks, very manageable. Claire said yes before she'd thought through what yes meant. Then she sat in the room above the garage with her phone in her hand, and the reality settling over her like cold water. February was 3 months away. The book tour was 4. And somewhere in between, she needed to figure out whether the room was actually hers or just borrowed, whether the Tuesdays were actually important or just a routine that would dissolve the moment she left town. That Tuesday, she didn't bring her laptop. She brought the schedule her publisher had sent, the one with 8 cities marked in red and estimated attendance numbers beside each venue. She arrived at 2 exactly and found Grayson rebuilding an alternator with the focused intensity of surgery. He glanced up, registered, her empty hands set down the multimeter he'd been using. "No writing today?" "Not today. I need to show you something." She spread the schedule on the cleared section of workbench. Grayson wiped his hands and looked at it without touching the paper, reading the way he read everything, completely retaining every detail. "Book tour," he said finally. "Yeah, February through March. Maybe into April if they add more cities." "Congratulations." "Thanks." Claire waited for him to say something else, to ask what it meant for the room, or the Tuesdays, or any of the small rituals they'd built. He didn't. He just looked at the schedule with the same expression he used when diagnosing a transmission information, received processing initiated. "You'll need the chair serviced before you go," he said. "Long-distance travel's hard on bearings. I'll check everything over, make sure you've got spares." That was it. No questions about when she was coming back, or whether she was coming back at all. Just the practical concern of making sure her equipment wouldn't fail in the middle of a tour through cities she'd never been to, with infrastructure she couldn't predict. Claire felt something twist in her chest. "That's all you're going to say?" Grayson looked at her. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something about the room, about whether I should keep paying rent while I'm gone, or whether you want it back, or the room's yours. You paid through December. What you do with it is your business." "But if I'm not here?" "Claire." He said her name quietly, the way he said most things, but with a weight that made her stop talking. "You think I gave you that room because I needed $50 a month?" She hadn't actually, but hearing him say it made the reality more solid. "Then why?" "Because you needed a place that was yours, and I had space that was empty. The math was simple." He picked up the multimeter again, didn't look at her. "You being here or not being here doesn't change the math." It should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like a door closing on a question Claire hadn't known she wanted to ask. She looked at the tour schedule, at the cities spread across 2 months, at the careful notation her publicist had added about wheelchair accessibility at each venue. "I'm scared," she said, surprising herself. Grayson set the multimeter down again. "Of what?" "That I'll get out there and realize I'm not actually ready. That the chair will break somewhere, I can't fix it. That I'll—" She stopped, started over. "I haven't done anything like this since before the accident. Real travel, real distances, real dependence on equipment and infrastructure. I can't control." "What if I can't do it?" "Then you'll figure it out." Same way you figured out how to write with a broken chair. Same way you figured out how to live in a body that works differently. He looked at her directly. You're not scared you can't do it. You're scared it'll work and you won't know what to do with yourself after. The observation landed like a punch. Claire opened her mouth to argue, realized she didn't have an argument, closed it again. Grayson went back to the alternator. Your chair's solid. I'll make it more solid before you leave. And if something breaks on the road, you call me, and I'll talk you through fixing it yourself. You're not doing this alone just because you're doing it away from here. Claire looked at him for a long moment, at the careful precision of his hands, at the way he approached every problem, like it had a solution if you just looked at it clearly enough. Something in her chest unclenched slightly. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen what I'm going to charge you for the pre-tour service? She almost smiled. Fair price, I'm sure. Always. Ren arrived at 5:30 earlier than usual and found Claire and Grayson both bent over the tour schedule, trying to identify which cities would be hardest for wheelchair navigation. She dumped her backpack and peered at the paper with interest. You're going on tour. Looks like it. Are you famous? No, but my book's getting published, so I have to go talk about it in different cities. That sounds boring, Claire laughed. It probably will be, but it's part of the job. Ren studied the schedule more carefully. You're going to Boston. My mom was from Boston. The statement dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. Grayson's hand stopped moving. Claire glanced at him, but his face was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. I didn't know that, Claire said carefully. Yeah, she used to tell me about the harbor and the old buildings and how everything was made of brick. Ren touched the schedule where Boston was marked. She said she'd take me there someday, when I was old enough to appreciate it. The silence that followed had texture. Grayson set down the wrench he'd been holding and looked at his daughter with an expression Claire had never seen on him before, something raw and undefended grief without the armor he usually carried. You should go, he said quietly to Ren. Someday, when you're older. Will you take me if you want me to? Or maybe Claire could send pictures. Ren looked at Claire hopefully. If you're going there anyway, of the brick buildings and the harbor, so I can see what Mom was talking about. Claire felt her throat tighten. Yeah, I can do that. Cool. Ren picked up her backpack and headed for the office area, where she usually did homework, apparently satisfied. The moment she was out of earshot, Grayson let out a long breath. I'm sorry, Claire said. I didn't know. Nothing to be sorry for. He picked up the wrench again. Didn't use it, just held it. Sarah talked about Boston a lot. She grew up there, moved out here for college, never really went back after we got married. She always meant to show Ren where she came from. A pause. Then she ran out of time. Claire wanted to say something comforting, but every phrase that came to mind felt inadequate. I'm sorry for your loss. She sounds like she was wonderful. At least Ren has memories. All of it true, all of it useless. Instead, she said, I'll take good pictures. Grayson looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close to it. I know you will. The subject of the tour didn't come up again that day, but it sat between them like furniture they'd have to navigate around eventually. Claire went back to the room after Ren left for piano lessons and sat at the desk looking at the painting her mother had made 30 years ago. A garage lit from within. Important work happening in warm light while the world outside went dark. She wondered if her mother had known when she painted it that someday her daughter would live in a room above a place exactly like it would find steadiness in the company of a man who fixed things for a living and asked for nothing but honesty in return. Probably not. Her mother had painted what she saw, had found beauty in functional spaces where people built things that lasted. The rest was coincidence or fate, or just the way the world worked when you paid attention to what mattered. The manuscript deadline for the new book was June, but Claire's editor wanted to see the first 3 chapters by December to make sure the concept was solid, which meant Claire spent most of November writing instead of traveling, researching trail conditions from her laptop instead of experiencing them firsthand, calling park services and asking questions about grade percentages and surface materials, and how often the accessible trails were actually maintained. One ranger in Montana told her flat out that their accessible trail hadn't been graded in 3 years and was probably impassable for any wheelchair that wasn't motorized and tank-treaded. Another in Colorado admitted that accessible just meant there was a paved path to the viewpoint, not that the viewpoint was actually worth seeing compared to the trails that required scrambling over rocks. A third asked if Claire had considered that maybe some places weren't meant to be accessible, that wilderness was supposed to be wild, that accommodating every disability meant destroying the very thing people came to experience. Claire wrote down every word of that conversation and turned it into a chapter about gatekeeping disguised as environmental protection. The chapter came out angry, sharper than anything else she'd written, and when she read it to Grayson on a Tuesday in late November, he listened without interrupting and then said, "You should keep it exactly like that. It's pretty harsh. It's true, and you're not writing to make people comfortable. I'm also not writing to alienate every Park Service employee in the country." Then why are you writing it? Claire thought about the question. Because someone needs to say it. That accessibility isn't about making wilderness less wild. It's about making sure the wild is available to people whose bodies work differently. Then say it. Grayson went back to the brake assembly he'd been rebuilding. People who are going to be alienated were never going to listen anyway. Write for the ones who will. It was the longest opinion he'd ever offered on her work. Claire saved the chapter without changing a word. Thanksgiving came. Claire had no family to go to and hadn't celebrated the holiday since her mother died. Grayson didn't mention plans and Claire didn't ask. On Thursday morning, she went down to the shop and found it closed lights off, the kind of dark that meant nobody was coming back today. She felt the absence like a physical thing, the silence where the sound of tools usually lived. She went back upstairs and tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. Tried to read, but couldn't focus. Ended up at the window, watching the empty parking lot and feeling foolish for not realizing that, of course, Grayson would spend Thanksgiving with Wren, would probably go to his in-laws or to friends, would have a life that existed entirely separate from the Tuesdays in the shop and the strange friendship they'd built in the margins. At 4 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the door to the room. Claire opened it to find Wren standing there holding a casserole dish with oven mitts. "Dad says dinner's at 5 if you want to come." Claire blinked. "Where?" "Upstairs, our place." Wren gestured vaguely above them. "He made too much food and Grandma Rita can't come because she's sick, and he said it was dumb for you to eat alone when we have extra." "I don't want to intrude. It's turkey and mashed potatoes and this cranberry thing I don't like, but Dad makes anyway." "You're not intruding. You're helping us eat stuff." Wren shifted the casserole dish. "This is hot. Can you open the door?" Claire opened the door. Wren went through and up a staircase Claire had never climbed into, an apartment that occupied the space above the shop proper. It was small, 2 bedrooms and a shared living area, but organized with the same precision as the garage below. Books on shelves arranged by size, dishes in cabinets aligned by type, a single couch that looked broken in and comfortable, the kind of furniture that had been used hard and often. Grayson was in the kitchen area, which was really just a corner of the living room with a stove and a sink and limited counter space. He looked up when they came in, registered Claire's presence, nodded once. "You eat turkey. I eat turkey. Good, sit down. This will be ready in 10 minutes. Claire sat. Wren disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a battered copy of a book about constellations, which she proceeded to show Claire with the intensity of someone explaining something vitally important. Apparently, there was a meteor shower happening next week, and if the clouds cleared, they might be able to see it from the parking lot because Meridian had less light pollution than Boise. "Do you like space?" Wren asked. "I like it fine. I don't know much about it." "Dad knows a lot. He used to build things for airplanes, and airplanes go up towards space even though they don't actually get to space." "Right, Dad." From the kitchen, "Right. And Mom used to say that when people died, they became stars. But Dad says that's not scientifically accurate. They just become part of the Earth again. But I like the star idea better." Grayson brought plates to the small table, set them down without comment. The food was simple but prepared with care. Turkey cooked exactly right, potatoes, mashed smooth cranberry sauce from a can, because nobody had time to make it from scratch, and canned worked fine. They ate without ceremony. Wren talked about school and the meteor shower and a project she was doing about ecosystems. Claire answered questions when asked. Grayson mostly listened, contributing occasional facts when Wren's science got wobbly. It was the most normal thing Claire had done in years. Just dinner with people who didn't need her to be anything other than present. No performance of gratitude for including her. No careful navigation of what topics were safe. Just eating food and talking about stars and not filling every silence with noise. After dinner, Wren asked if Claire wanted to see her room. It was small, dominated by a bed and a bookshelf and drawings pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. Drawings of constellations, mostly. Careful pencil work showing the major stars connected by lines labeled in Wren's neat print. Did you draw all these? Dad showed me how. He used to draw a lot before Mom died. Now he mostly just draws machine parts, but he's still good at it. Claire looked at the drawings more carefully. They were good. Better than good. The proportions were exact, the shading, subtle, the kind of work that came from someone who understood how to see accurately before putting pencil to paper. He doesn't show anyone, Wren added. But I saw the sketchbook in his room once. It's full of buildings and bridges and stuff. Really detailed. Something clicked in Claire's memory. The systematic precision. The way Grayson approached mechanical problems like they were three-dimensional puzzles. The comment he'd made months ago about aerospace engineering, about designing components that had to work perfectly, because failure at 30,000 feet meant people died. He was good at his old job, Claire said carefully. He was. But he quit after Mom died because he said he couldn't make himself care about stuff that didn't matter anymore. Wren traced one of the constellation drawings with her finger. I asked him once if anything mattered now, and he said I did. But I don't think that's enough for a whole person, you know. Like I matter, but I'm just one thing. Adults need more things to matter, or they get sad. Claire felt something twist behind her ribs. Has your dad been sad? Sometimes, not like crying sad, just quiet sad. The kind where he works in the shop until really late and then sits in the office staring at nothing. Wren looked at Claire directly. He's been less quiet sad since you started coming on Tuesdays. Before Claire could figure out how to respond to that, Grayson called from the other room that it was time for Wren's pre-bed reading. Wren grabbed a book from her shelf and left. Claire stayed in the small room looking at the constellation drawings and feeling like she'd just been handed information she didn't know what to do with. When she came back to the living area, Grayson and Wren were on the couch with a book about geology open between them. Wren was leaning against her father's shoulder while he read about sedimentary layers and how rocks remembered everything that happened to them over millions of years. His voice was steady and unhurried, the same voice he used to explain mechanical problems, applying the same systematic precision to teaching his daughter about the world. Claire sat in the chair across from them and listened. When the chapter finished, Wren went to brush her teeth without argument. The moment her bedroom door closed, Grayson looked at Claire. She cornered you. About what? About me being sad. She has a theory that adults need multiple things to care about or they deteriorate. She's probably right. She said you've been less sad since I started coming around. Grayson was quiet for a moment. She's observant. Is she right? Yeah. He said it simply, no elaboration, just stating a fact. Why? Because for 3 years, the only thing I had to care about was not failing Wren. Making sure she survived, making sure she was okay, making sure her heart kept working, and she got to school on time, and she didn't notice how much I was just going through motions. He closed the geology book, set it on the table. And then you showed up with a broken chair, and you sat in my shop and worked on something that mattered to you. And it reminded me that caring about things was still possible, that I hadn't actually lost the ability. I'd just forgotten what it felt like. The words settled over Claire like something physical. She wanted to say that she understood that she'd felt the same way, that the Tuesdays had given her back something she'd thought the accident had taken. But Grayson wasn't done talking. You're leaving in February, he said. And that's good. That's what should happen. You should go do the work you're supposed to be doing. He looked at her directly. But I need you to understand that the room's yours whether you're in it or not. The Tuesdays are yours whether you're here on Tuesdays. You don't owe me anything for using space I wasn't using anyway. You don't have to come back if the tour turns into something bigger. I just need you to know that if you want to come back, the door's open. Claire felt her throat tighten. I want to come back. Okay. I mean it. The tour's 2 weeks, maybe 3 if they add cities. But after that, I'm coming back here because this is... She stopped, started over. This is the first place that's felt like it could be home since before the accident. And I don't want to lose that just because I'm traveling for work. Grayson nodded slowly. Then it'll be here. They sat in the quiet of his living room, surrounded by books organized by size and drawings of constellations pinned to a 9-year-old's wall. Outside, the November night pressed against the windows. Inside, something had shifted without either of them naming it exactly. Not quite a promise. Not quite a commitment. Just an understanding that the space they'd made between them had value worth preserving. Wren came back in pajamas and announced she was ready for bed. Grayson stood to tuck her in. Before he disappeared into her room, he looked back at Claire. "You're welcome to stay, watch TV, read whatever. Just lock the door when you leave." Claire stayed. She sat on the couch that had been broken in by years of use and read 3 chapters of a book she'd been putting off while Grayson put his daughter to bed in the next room. When he came back out, he didn't say anything, just sat on the other end of the couch and picked up his own book, and they read in comfortable silence until Claire's eyes started to blur and she realized it was past midnight. "I should go." "Probably." Grayson set down his book. "Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for inviting me." "Wren invited you. I just didn't object." Claire smiled despite herself. "Either way." She went back to the room that was hers, whether she was in it or not, the room with the painting of a garage lit from within, and she lay in the narrow bed thinking about what Wren had said. That adults needed multiple things to matter, or they deteriorated. That Grayson had been quiet, sad for 3 years until the Tuesdays started. Claire had been quiet, sad too, she realized. Had been living in the small space of what was possible with broken equipment and low expectations. Had stopped pushing against the world's assumptions because pushing took energy she didn't have, and the world didn't change anyway. But then Grayson had fixed her chair and suddenly pushing was possible again, and with it came the reminder that she'd spent 6 years accepting limitations that weren't hers to accept. The book tour was going to be hard. The travel writing after would be harder. But for the first time since the accident, Claire wanted to do hard things again. Wanted to see whether her body and her equipment and her determination could actually take her to the places she used to go, could produce the work she used to produce. And after when the hard things were done, she wanted to come back to a room above a garage in Idaho, where a man who fixed things for a living had given her space to exist without needing anything from her except the truth. December arrived with the kind of cold that made metal brittle and bearings reluctant. Grayson insisted on servicing Claire's chair before the temperature dropped further, so she spent a Tuesday watching him disassemble and inspect every component with the thoroughness of someone who understood that failure was often the accumulation of small, neglected problems. He replaced both rear bearings, even though they weren't worn out yet, on the theory that fresh bearings now meant less chance of failure during the tour. Re-greased everything with cold weather lubricant that wouldn't stiffen when the temperature dropped. Checked every bolt for tension, every weld for hairline cracks, every connection point for play. When he finished, the chair was tighter and more responsive than it had been even when he'd first fixed it. "This should hold you through spring," he said, handing her the chair. "But if anything feels off, anything at all, you stop and check it. Don't wait for it to get worse." "I know." "I'm serious, Claire. Equipment failure when you're alone is dangerous. You feel grinding, you feel pull, you feel anything that isn't right, you stop." "I will." He looked at her for a moment longer, clearly not convinced. Then he went to the workbench and came back with a small toolkit, the kind that folded into a canvas roll and could fit under a seat. Inside were Allen wrenches in every size her chair used, a spoke wrench, a chain breaker, spare bolts, a tube of thread locker, and a small container of grease. "You know how to use all of this." "I know the Allen wrenches. The rest I'd need you to show me." So he showed her. Spent an hour teaching her how to diagnose and fix the most common problems. A loose axle bolt bent, spoke a slipping brake cable. Walked her through each repair step by step, making her do it herself while he watched and corrected when she used too much force or not enough. "Why are you teaching me this?" Claire asked after she'd successfully removed and reinstalled an axle for the 3rd time. "Because if something breaks in Boston or Seattle or wherever, I can't fix it for you, but I can make sure you know how to fix it yourself. What if I call you and you talk me through it? Then I'll talk you through it, but you should know the basics anyway. Your chair's the most important piece of equipment you own. You should know how it works." By the time they finished, Claire's hands were dirty and her shoulders were tired, and she understood her chair in a way she never had before. Not just as a thing she used, but as a machine she maintained, a tool she was responsible for keeping functional. The knowledge felt like power, like taking back territory she'd ceded without realizing it. The first 3 chapters of the new manuscript went to her editor on December 15th. She called back 2 days later with enthusiasm that felt genuine rather than performative. The concept was strong. The voice was sharp. The market was ready for something that challenged assumptions about accessibility. Could Claire deliver the full manuscript by June? Because if so, they wanted to publish in October, ride the momentum from the first book into the second. Claire said yes, then immediately regretted it. June was 6 months away. The tour took up February and March, which meant she had April, May, and part of June to research and write a book that required traveling to at least 8 national parks and documenting infrastructure that might or might not exist. She spread a map on the workbench during a Tuesday session and stared at it like it might reveal solutions. Grayson glanced over from the engine he was rebuilding. That's a lot of territory. Yeah. When do you start? April. I need to finish the tour first, then do the parks research before fire season starts, and half of them close backcountry access. That's tight. I know. Claire traced a route between parks with her finger. Yellowstone to Glacier, to North Cascades, to Olympic. Then down the coast to Redwood and Yosemite and Joshua Tree. 17,000 miles of driving, most of it through terrain her chair had never been tested on. I'm probably insane for thinking I can do this. Probably. Grayson set down the piston he'd been examining. But you wouldn't be thinking about it if you didn't already know you could. I don't know that. You do. You're just scared of what it means if you succeed. The observation hit harder than it should have. Claire looked at him. What does it mean? That you're not limited by your body. You're limited by equipment and infrastructure and other people's assumptions. And those are things you can change. I can't change the Park Service. No, but you can document what's actually there versus what they claim is there. Make it impossible for them to keep saying accessible when they mean barely navigable. He picked up the piston again. That's what the book's actually about, right? Not whether you personally can access wilderness, whether wilderness is being made accessible or whether it's just being marketed that way. Claire stared at the map. When did you become an expert in what my book's about? I've been listening to you talk about it for 3 months. I pay attention. She felt something warm spread through her chest. Grayson was right. The book wasn't about her. It was about the gap between promise and reality, about systems that claimed inclusion while building barriers, about the difference between access and accessibility. She'd been so focused on whether she could physically do the research that she'd lost sight of why it mattered. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For paying attention. Grayson went back to the engine. That's what I do. Christmas came. Claire had planned to spend it alone in the room working on revisions her editor had sent for the first book. Instead, she came down on Christmas morning and found a small wrapped package outside her door with a note in Grayson's handwriting, "For the road, G." Inside was a first aid kit, size for wheelchair storage, compact but thorough. Bandages, antibiotic ointment, pain medication, blister treatment, antiseptic wipes, emergency thermal blanket. Everything organized in labeled pouches that fit perfectly in the space under her seat. The kit was new, but the organization was pure Grayson, every item placed with intention. Claire went upstairs and knocked. Wren answered, still in pajamas, excited about the presents under their small tree. Grayson was making breakfast, bacon and eggs and coffee that smelled better than what he made in the shop. Thank you for the kit, Claire said. He glanced back from the stove. You're going to be alone on the road. Seemed useful. It is, thank you. You're welcome. He went back to the bacon. You eating breakfast, or are you going to stand there being grateful? Claire ate breakfast. Gave Wren the book about accessible trails she'd found online, which delighted the girl because it had photographs of people in wheelchairs doing things most people assumed wheelchair users couldn't do. Gave Grayson a set of precision instruments she'd special ordered from an aerospace tool supplier, the kind he probably couldn't justify buying himself, but would use constantly once he had them. He opened the box, looked at the tools for a long moment, then looked at her. These are expensive. You fixed my chair for $270. Consider us even. We were already even. Then consider this a thank you for everything after. Grayson ran his hand over the instruments, testing the weight and balance. High-quality tools had a feel to them, a rightness that cheap versions never achieved. He picked up a digital caliper, examined it with appreciation. "Thank you," he said quietly. They spent Christmas morning in the apartment above the garage eating breakfast and opening modest presents and not talking about the fact that in 6 weeks Claire would leave and everything would change. Wren showed off her book to anyone who would pay attention. Grayson used the new calipers to measure increasingly random objects around the apartment with Wren's delighted assistance. Claire sat on the broken-in couch and felt something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. Not temporary belonging, not contingent on being useful or grateful or performing the right emotions. Just the simple fact of being in a place with people who didn't need her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. That afternoon, after Wren went to a friend's house and the apartment fell quiet, Grayson made actual good coffee using a French press Claire hadn't known he owned, and they sat at the small table by the window. "I need to tell you something," he said. Claire's stomach tightened. "Okay. After Sarah died, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was sad, though I was, because the house was too quiet, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the accident, saw what the police said happened, even though I wasn't there." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "So I started working in the shop at night, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, just fixing things, rebuilding engines I'd already rebuilt, organizing tools that were already organized, anything to not be alone with the quiet." Claire waited. Grayson wasn't someone who shared personal history casually. If he was telling her this, it meant something. "I did that for 2 years, worked myself numb. Wren slept, and I worked, and I told myself I was fine because I was functional. I was getting her to school, keeping the shop running, paying the bills. That was enough." He looked at Claire. "Then you showed up on a Tuesday and sat in the corner and worked on something that mattered, and I realized I'd forgotten what it looked like when someone cared about their work instead of just doing it to fill time. Grayson, I'm not telling you this to make you feel responsible for fixing me. You didn't. I'm still broken in most of the ways I was broken before. But you reminded me that broken doesn't mean non-functional, that you can work around damage if you understand it clearly enough." He set down the coffee mug. "You're going to leave in February and do important work, and I'm going to keep fixing cars and raising my daughter. That's good. That's what should happen. But I need you to know that the Tuesdays mattered, not because I need them to continue, because they already happened." Claire felt tears threaten and pushed them back. "They mattered to me too. I know. I'm coming back. I believe you." He picked up the mug again. "But if you don't, if the tour becomes something bigger, or you find better places to work, or you just realize you don't need a garage in Idaho anymore, that's okay too. The room's yours until you say otherwise." "I'll come back," Claire said firmly. "I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true. This is the first place I've felt at home since my mother died. I'm not giving that up just because I'm traveling for work." Grayson nodded slowly. Then he did something Claire had never seen him do. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly, a single moment of contact that said everything he couldn't put into words. Then he let go and went back to his coffee, and the moment passed into the category of things that had happened and didn't need to be discussed further. January was preparation. Claire organized her research schedule, confirmed accessibility contacts at each park planned routes that would minimize highway miles and maximize trail time. Her publisher sent interview requests for the February tour, 8 cities, 14 events, dozens of podcasts and bookstore readings and library talks. The publicist wanted talking points about overcoming adversity. Claire wrote back, explaining she wasn't interested in inspiration porn. She was interested in discussing infrastructure failure and how accessibility was treated as accommodation rather than right. The publicist revised the talking points. The chair got a final service on the last Tuesday in January. Grayson checked everything twice, packed extra bearings, added a second spare axle he'd machined from chromoly stock. He showed Claire again how to diagnose problems, made her practice removing and installing wheels until she could do it blindfolded. "If something breaks, I call you, I know. And if you can't reach me, I figure it out myself using what you taught me." "Good." He handed her a laminated card with his cell number and the shop number and an emergency contact for a wheelchair repair specialist in Seattle who owed him a favor. "Keep this somewhere accessible. Not in your bag. On you." Claire put the card in her wallet. "You're acting like I'm going to war." You're going on a book tour with equipment that can fail. Close enough. The last Tuesday before she left, Claire didn't bring her laptop. She spent the afternoon just sitting in the shop watching Grayson work, memorizing the systematic precision of his movements, the way he organized his tools, the way he approached each problem as solvable if you just looked at it correctly. The particular quality of quiet that filled the space when they were both there doing separate work. At 5:30, Wren arrived and gave Claire an envelope. Inside was a drawing of the Orion constellation, carefully labeled with a note, "For when you're far away and need to know where you are. Love, Wren." Claire hugged her, which surprised them both. Wren hugged back fiercely. "You're coming back, right?" "I'm coming back. Promise, I promise." "Good. Because Tuesdays are weird when you're not here." At 6 o'clock, Claire went back to the room one last time, packed her laptop and clothes and the first aid kit Grayson had given her, left the painting on the wall, left books on the shelf and coffee in the cabinet and all the small evidences of occupation that marked the space as hers. Then she locked the door and went to give Grayson the key back. "Keep it," he said. "You're coming back in 3 weeks. What if I lose it? Then I'll make you another one." Claire looked at the key in her palm. Small, ordinary, made of brass that had worn smooth with use. A key to a room that was hers, whether she was in it or not, in a building where a man who fixed things had given her space to heal without asking for anything except the truth. She closed her fist around it. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. Grayson agreed. Then Claire left for the tour that would take her to 8 cities and force her to prove that she could still do the work she'd been trained for. She drove away from Meridian with her chair precisely maintained and her toolkit complete, and the knowledge that she was leaving something important behind. But it would be there when she got back. The room would be there. The Tuesdays would be there. Grayson would be there fixing things with quiet hands and systematic precision. And Claire, for the first time in 6 years, was absolutely certain she'd be there too. The tour started in Seattle with rain so persistent it felt personal. Claire pushed through slick streets from her hotel to the bookstore, her chair's tires hydroplaning slightly on wet pavement, and arrived to find 17 people scattered among folding chairs arranged in optimistic rows of 40. The bookstore owner looked apologetic. The publicist looked tense. Claire looked at the small crowd and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite relief, but close to it. Smaller meant intimate. Intimate meant honest. She could work with honest. The reading went well. Questions were sharp, mostly from people who understood that accessibility wasn't charity, but infrastructure. One woman in a power chair asked about the chapter on gatekeeping, whether Claire thought park services were actively hostile or just passively negligent. Claire answered that incompetence and malice produced identical results for the person stuck at the bottom of stairs that shouldn't exist. The room laughed, then went silent in the way rooms did when truth interrupted comfort. Afterward, a man approached with a book to sign. He was maybe 60, walked with forearm crutches, and had the particular look of someone who'd been navigating inaccessible spaces long enough to recognize another veteran. The chapter about the ranger who said wilderness should stay wild, he said while Claire signed his book. That happened to you, verbatim. What did you say back? Nothing productive. But I wrote it down and put it in the book, which felt better than yelling, he laughed. I've been accessing wilderness for 40 years. It doesn't get easier, just more documented. Claire handed back the signed book. Is that supposed to be encouraging? It's supposed to be true. Encouragement's cheaper. He shifted his weight on the crutches. Your chair. Custom build, modified racing chair, titanium frame. Who does your service? Small shop in Idaho. Guy named Grayson Hale. Best mechanic I've ever met. The man pulled out his phone, typed the name into notes. I'm in Spokane. My chair's been pulling left for 6 months and nobody can figure out why. Mind if I call him? He'd probably appreciate the business. If he's half as good as you say, I'll send him everyone I know. The man headed for the door, then turned back. The book's good. Not inspiration porn. Actual documentation. We need more of that. By the time Claire made it back to the hotel, exhaustion had settled into her shoulders like wet concrete. The reading had only been an hour, but performing honesty drained something essential. She transferred to the hotel bed and checked her phone. 2 texts from her publicist about tomorrow's event in Portland. 1 from her editor about early review quotes. Nothing from Grayson, but she hadn't expected anything. He wasn't someone who sent unnecessary communication. She sent him a message anyway. Seattle done, 17 people, one lead for new customer in Spokane. Call if you want details. The phone rang 4 minutes later. You told someone to call me. Grayson's voice familiar and steady. Guy with forearm crutches, chairs pulling left. I said you were the best mechanic I'd ever met. That's overselling. That's accuracy. Claire shifted against the pillows. How's Idaho? Cold. How's Seattle? Wet. The reading was good, though. Small crowd, but engaged. Small's better. You can actually talk to people instead of performing at them. Claire smiled despite the tiredness. That's what I thought. Brief silence. Then, Ren wants to know if you've taken any pictures yet. Of what rain? She's 9. She'd probably find rain exciting if it came from somewhere that isn't here. Tell her I'll send pictures from Portland. Better architecture. I'll tell her. Another pause. Your chair holding up. Perfectly. No pull. No grind. No issues. Good. The relief in his voice was subtle but present. You check the bearings after pushing through wet streets. Not yet. Do it before you drive tomorrow. Water can work its way into seals if you're not careful. Grayson, the bearings are sealed cartridge. I know what they are. Check them anyway. Claire checked them. Found nothing wrong but felt better having looked. The ritual of maintenance was its own reassurance proof that she understood her equipment well enough to keep it functional. She wiped down the frame, dried the push rims, packed everything carefully for the morning drive south. Portland was better attended. 34 people, genuine enthusiasm, questions that went deep instead of skating surface. A journalist from the local paper wanted to interview her about accessibility in the Pacific Northwest, whether cities were improving or just claiming improvement while changing nothing substantial. Claire gave her an hour and the names of 3 accessibility advocates who could provide better data than anecdote. The publicist was pleased. Early sales numbers were trending above expectations. The publisher wanted to add 2 more cities to the tour, maybe extend into April. Claire said she'd think about it, knowing she'd say no. April was for research. The National Parks Project couldn't wait indefinitely. San Francisco brought rain again, and a bookstore with stairs. The owner had assured the publicist they were accessible, which turned out to mean they'd put a folding ramp over the steps that was too steep for safe use and too narrow for Claire's chair width. She ended up doing the reading from the sidewalk while people stood on the stairs and in the doorway. It worked barely, but the humiliation of having to adapt on the fly while the bookstore owner kept apologizing without fixing anything was degradation Claire had hoped to avoid. She wrote about it that night, not for the current book, but for the next one, The Parks Project, a chapter about how accessible often meant we tried and thought that absolved responsibility. The writing came fast and angry, therapeutic in the way documentation always was, converting rage into record. Her phone rang at 11 p.m. Grayson, which was unusual. He didn't call unless something needed immediate attention. You okay? He asked without preamble. Yeah, why? You posted a photo of a ramp on Instagram with a caption about slope angles and ADA compliance. Seemed angry. Claire had forgotten she'd posted that. The ramp had been egregious enough to warrant documentation criminal in its inadequacy. I'm fine, just annoyed. The bookstore claimed they were accessible. Turned out accessible meant a ramp too steep to use safely. I ended up reading from the sidewalk. Grayson was silent for a moment. Then, you want me to call them and say what? That their ramp's illegal and dangerous, and they're lucky nobody got hurt. That claiming accessibility without providing it is worse than admitting you can't accommodate, because at least admission is honest. Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. You'd do that if you want me to. I want to, but I probably shouldn't. Professional relationships and all that. Then document it and move on. But if it happens again, I'm calling. Deal. After they hung up, Claire lay in the dark hotel room, thinking about the fact that someone 2 states away was angry on her behalf about inadequate infrastructure. That Grayson had seen a photo and recognized it as evidence of a problem serious enough to warrant checking if she was okay. That he'd offered to intervene not because she couldn't handle it herself, but because sometimes it helped to know someone else saw the same injustice clearly. Los Angeles was massive and overwhelming and actually accessible. The venue had proper ramps, wide aisles, accessible restroom staff who understood how to assist without patronizing. 70 people attended. Claire sold 43 books afterward. The publicist was ecstatic. The publisher wanted to talk about a second printing. Claire called Grayson from the hotel room and told him about the numbers. "That's good," he said. "You sound tired, though." "I am tired. This is more people-facing than I'm used to." "How many more cities?" "3. Phoenix, Denver, Boston. Then I'm done." "Then what?" "Then I come home for a week and start planning the park's research." Brief silence on the line. Then home. Claire realized what she'd said. "I mean Idaho. The room." "I meant." "I know what you meant." His voice was even. "It's good that you have somewhere to come back to." "Yeah." Taberna. Claire looked at the hotel room that was identical to every other hotel room she'd stayed in for the past 2 weeks. Generic art, generic furniture, generic everything. "Yeah, it is." Phoenix brought heat that made her chair's metal frame almost too hot to touch. She did 2 readings in one day, sold 60 books, combined fielded questions about whether she'd ever climbed mountains before the accident. The answer was no, but she'd hiked extensively, had spent months at a time in backcountry doing research for articles most people never read. The accident had taken that away, not because her body couldn't do it anymore, but because the infrastructure assumed wheelchairs meant pavement. A college student asked if she was angry about that. Claire thought about the question about the 6 years she'd spent accepting limitations that weren't biological, about the mechanic in Idaho who'd fixed her chair and accidentally fixed her understanding of what was actually broken. "I'm not angry, I'm determined. Anger burns out. Determination builds documentation." The line felt important the moment she said it. Several people wrote it down. One asked if she could use it as a quote. Claire said yes, then forgot about it until 2 weeks later, when the same line showed up in a review from Publishers Weekly. Denver was cold and clear and brought the altitude problems Claire had expected. Her lungs worked fine, but the thin air made pushing harder, required more breaks, reminded her that adaptation was constant and variable. The reading went well despite breathlessness. Questions focused on the park's project, whether she'd tackle high-altitude locations. Claire explained that accessibility wasn't about whether she personally could access something, but whether the infrastructure existed for people with her disability to access it at all. An older woman with a manual chair raised her hand. "What about people who can't push at all, power chair users? Are you speaking for them?" "No, I'm speaking about my experience with my equipment. Power chair accessibility is different and equally important. I can't speak to that because I don't live it. So this is just about you. It's about documentation. I can document what I experience. Other people can document what they experience. Collectively, that builds a record that's harder to ignore than individual complaints." The woman nodded, satisfied. After the reading, she came up and apologized for the sharp question. "Don't apologize, it was valid." Claire signed her book. "I can't speak for every wheelchair user. I can only document my own infrastructure failures and hope someone with different equipment documents theirs." "You're doing good work," the woman said. "Keep documenting." Boston was last and mattered most because Wren had asked for pictures. Claire arrived 2 days early and spent them photographing the harbor, the old brick buildings, the narrow streets that weren't built for wheelchairs but existed anyway. She sent Wren a dozen photos with captions explaining what Sarah would have shown her Faneuil Hall, where revolutionaries had met the Old North Church, where lanterns had hung the harbor, where tea had been dumped in protest. Wren sent back a voice message, breathless with excitement. "These are so cool. Dad says Mom would have shown me the same stuff. Can you find the park where she used to feed ducks when she was little? It's called the Public Garden." Claire found it. Photographed the pond and the swan boats and the ducks that probably weren't the same ducks but were definitely descendants. Sent the photos to Wren with a message. "Tell your dad these ducks are very interested in visitors." Grayson called that night. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." Wren asked. "She's been showing everyone at school. You're going to get interrogated about Boston history when you get back. I can handle a 9-year-old's questions." "Don't be too sure. She's been researching." Brief pause. "Thank you, though, for taking this seriously." "It is serious. She lost her mom. If I can show her pieces of what her mom loved, that's not a burden. That's an honor." Grayson was silent for a long moment. Then, when do you fly home? Day after tomorrow. Readings tomorrow night. Then I drive to the airport the next morning. Long drive. 3 hours, I've done worse. Call me when you land. Let me know you made it. I will. The Boston reading was packed. 83 people standing room, only energy that crackled with the particular intensity of a city that thought about accessibility because it was forced to navigate infrastructure from the 18th century. Questions were sharp and specific. Someone asked about the T-Boston subway system, whether Claire had tried to use it. She had that afternoon and had failed to access 2 stations before finding one with a working elevator. That's par for the course. A man in a power chair called from the back. The T's accessibility is theoretical. The room laughed grimly. Claire talked about the difference between compliance and function, about how cities could meet ADA requirements on paper while creating systems that remained fundamentally unusable. The conversation went long past the scheduled hour into territory that felt more like organizing than book promotion. Afterward, a woman approached who introduced herself as a city planner working on accessibility improvements. She wanted to know if Claire would consult on a project. Claire gave her the contact information for 3 accessibility advocates in Boston who knew the infrastructure better than someone passing through. The woman looked disappointed. You've documented problems I didn't know existed. That's valuable perspective. It's not unique perspective. Every wheelchair user in this city knows the same problems. You just haven't been asking them. The woman took the contact information. Claire hoped she'd actually use it. The drive to the airport the next morning was complicated by snow unexpected for late March, enough to make pushing through the parking lot exhausting. By the time Claire made it through security and to her gate, her shoulders burned and her wrists ached, and she wanted nothing more than to be horizontal somewhere that demanded nothing from her. The flight was delayed, then delayed again, then canceled entirely due to weather. The airline rebooked her on a flight the next morning, offered a hotel voucher, apologized for the inconvenience. Claire called Grayson from the airport terminal. I'm stuck in Boston until tomorrow. Storm canceled everything. You have a place to stay. Hotel voucher, I'll be fine. Your chair okay? Tired, like me, but functional. Check the bearings when you get to the hotel. Salt on the roads can corrode seals. Grayson, I pushed through a parking lot, not the ocean. Salt, salt. Check them. She checked them. Found nothing wrong but wiped everything down anyway, the ritual calming in its predictability. Then she lay on the hotel bed and felt the accumulated exhaustion of 3 weeks collapse into something approaching despair. Not because the tour had gone badly, it had gone well better than expected, but because she was tired of performing, tired of explaining, tired of adapting to infrastructure that should have adapted to her. Her phone buzzed. Text from Grayson. Ren says to tell you the duck photos are her favorite. She printed them and they're on her wall now with the constellations. Claire smiled despite the tiredness. Texted back, tell her I'm glad. See you Tuesday. See you Tuesday. 3 words, simple and steady. The promise of return to a place where she didn't have to perform or explain or adapt beyond the ordinary adaptations of existing. Just Tuesday at 2 o'clock, Grayson at his workbench and Claire at her laptop in the comfortable silence of people doing separate work in shared space. She slept better than she had in 3 weeks. The flight the next morning was crowded but uneventful. Claire landed in Boise at 2:30, retrieved her rental car, drove the 40 minutes to Meridian through afternoon sun that felt aggressive after Boston snow. She stopped at the hotel where she'd left most of her belongings, packed everything into the car, checked out. The desk clerk asked if she'd enjoyed her stay. Claire said it was fine. The desk clerk looked relieved, like fine was the highest compliment the place ever got. The garage looked exactly the same. Same brick, same painted sign, same sense of being a place that existed outside normal time. Claire parked and sat in the car for a moment, watching the bay door where Grayson was probably working on something mechanical with his usual precision. She felt nervous, which was stupid. It had been 3 weeks. Nothing had changed except her absence. She pushed through the side door into familiar space. The shop was warmer than outside, heated by machinery and work. Grayson was at the far bench, disassembling what looked like a transmission. He glanced up, registered her presence, set down his tools. You're early. Flight landed ahead of schedule. How was Boston after the storm? Cold, snowy. I survived. He walked over, looked at her chair with the critical eye of someone evaluating equipment condition. Bearings. Fine, I checked them twice because you'd ask. Good. He met her eyes. You look tired. I am tired, but I'm done. Tour's over. Successful. Depends how you measure success. Sold books, talked to people, documented inadequate infrastructure. Came home. She paused. That feels like success. A small shift crossed Grayson's face. Room's exactly like you left it. Nothing's moved. I didn't expect it to be. Ren's at piano until 5. She'll be excited you're back. I brought her something from Boston. Tourist thing. Probably tacky. She'll love it. Grayson picked up a shop rag, wiped his hands even though they weren't dirty. You want coffee? Is it still bad? Worse. I think the machine's dying. Then yes. He made coffee. She transferred to her usual stool in the corner. The space settled around her like a coat she'd forgotten she was wearing, familiar and necessary. Grayson went back to the transmission. Claire pulled out her laptop and opened the document where she'd been tracking notes for the park's project. At 5:15, Ren burst through the door with the energy of someone who'd been holding still for an hour and needed to expel it immediately. She saw Claire and shrieked, "You're back! I'm back! Did you bring pictures? Better, I brought you a thing." Claire pulled a small wrap package from her bag. Inside was a snow globe with the Boston skyline, objectively terrible, but somehow perfect for 9-year-olds. Ren shook it, watching artificial snow swirl around miniature buildings. This is so cool. I'm putting it next to the duck pictures. She disappeared upstairs with the snow globe. Grayson watched her go, then looked at Claire. You didn't have to bring her anything. I wanted to. She asked for Boston. I gave her Boston. She's going to want you to go everywhere now so you can bring back more things. I'm okay with that. Grayson went back to his work. Claire went back to her notes. The afternoon passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of tools and typing. At 6:30, Grayson started cleaning up. Claire closed her laptop. Same time next Tuesday, he asked. I'm here now. Why would I leave and come back? He stopped, looked at her. You're staying? In the room, yeah. That's what I'm paying rent for. You just got back from 3 weeks on the road. Thought you'd want a break. I want to sleep in a bed that's actually mine, and drink coffee that isn't hotel coffee, and work in a space where nobody's going to interrupt me to ask questions. She held his gaze. I want to be home. Grayson nodded slowly. Okay then. Welcome home. Claire went upstairs to the room that was hers, whether she occupied it or not. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, painting on the wall, books on the shelf, coffee in the cabinet. She unpacked her suitcase, hung up clothes, arranged toiletries in the bathroom. The rituals of settling. That night, she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the building. Grayson moving around in the apartment above, putting Ren to bed, reading to her from whatever science book they were currently working through. Water running through old pipes. The building settling into its foundation. Sounds that meant occupation, that meant home. She slept 10 hours and woke to sun streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting from downstairs. Not the shop coffee, something better, richer. She went down in sweatpants and found Grayson in the shop with a French press and 2 mugs. Figured you'd want actual coffee after 3 weeks of hotel garbage. You figured right. They drank coffee in silence while morning light angled through the windows. Grayson didn't ask about the tour. Claire didn't offer details. They'd covered the important parts already. Everything else was just data. At 7:45, he went upstairs to get Ren ready for school. Claire went back to the room and started organizing research notes for the park's project. Her editor wanted an outline by the end of April, which gave Claire 4 weeks to plan a research trip that would take her to 8 national parks across 6 states and document accessibility infrastructure that might or might not exist. The work was complicated by the fact that spring was variable in the mountains. Some parks wouldn't open backcountry trails until June. Others closed trails in May due to snow. Claire needed to time everything perfectly or risk arriving when the terrain was inaccessible, regardless of wheelchair capability. She spread maps across the desk, marked routes, calculated drive times, started calling park services to confirm trail conditions and accessibility claims. Got transferred 6 times at one park before reaching someone who admitted they didn't actually know if their accessible trail was currently passable because nobody had checked since last season. So you're marketing it as accessible without verifying it's functional. We verify before summer season starts. And when's that one of June 1st? And people booking trips for May. Silence on the line. Then I'll have someone check and call you back. They didn't call back. Claire documented the conversation and moved to the next park on her list. By noon, she had confirmed access to 3 parks, questionable access to 2, and complete uncertainty about the remaining 3. It wasn't enough to build a research schedule. She needed better data. Grayson came back from errands at 1 and found her staring at maps with the intensity of someone trying to solve an equation that had too many variables. Problem? He asked. Park services don't know if their own trails are accessible. Half of them haven't checked since last season. The other half admit they don't actually maintain the accessible trails with the same frequency as main trails. So you're planning a trip based on incomplete information? Basically. Grayson looked at the maps. What if you started with the ones you can confirm and built outward from there? Instead of trying to hit every park, hit the ones that are definitely accessible and use those as baseline for comparison. That's not comprehensive. Comprehensive's impossible if half the data doesn't exist. Better to document 3 parks accurately than 8 parks poorly. Claire sat back. He was right. She'd been thinking about the project as exhaustive survey when it should be strategic sampling. Document the best document, the worst document, the gap between claim and reality. Okay, 3 confirmed accessible parks, 3 definitely inaccessible, 2 in the middle. That's documentation range. That's methodology. Grayson picked up one of the maps. Which ones are confirmed? They spent the afternoon revising the research plan. Grayson asked questions about logistics that Claire hadn't considered, where she'd service the chair between parks, what she'd do if equipment failed in remote locations, how she'd handle emergency situations without cell service. He approached the trip as he approached mechanical problems: identify failure points, plan redundancy, prepare backup options. By 4 o'clock, Claire had a route that was actually achievable. 4 parks in May, 3 in June, 1 in July after fire restrictions lifted. Each park selected for different accessibility claims, different terrain, different infrastructure. Comprehensive enough to matter, focused enough to execute. Thank you for asking the questions I should have asked myself. You would have figured it out. I just sped up the process. He folded the map. When do you leave? May 3rd. I need to finish the outline. First, send it to my editor pack equipment. That's 3 weeks. Yeah. Your chair's going to need service before you go. Long-distance travel on variable terrain requires fresh bearings. I just had fresh bearings 3 months ago. And you just did 3 weeks of city pushing. Different wear pattern. He was already walking toward the lift platform. Bring it over. I'll check everything. The service took 2 hours and revealed where Claire hadn't noticed. Not enough to cause problems yet, but enough that another month would have. Grayson replaced both rear bearings, adjusted the anti-tip brackets which had loosened, slightly retensioned. The wheel spokes lubricated everything with fresh grease. You're good for another 5,000 miles, but check tension weekly while you're traveling. Variable terrain shakes things loose. I'll check. I mean it, Claire. Equipment failure in a national park is different than equipment failure in a city. Longer response time, fewer repair options, higher consequence. I know, I'll check. She transferred to the chair, tested the roll. Smooth and silent. What do I owe you? Service is free for returning customers. Grayson, you paid for the last service. This one's maintenance. That's different. Claire knew better than to argue. Thank you. You're welcome. Now get out of my shop. I have actual work to do. She went upstairs and spent the evening turning her research plan into a formal outline. The structure was simple: 8 parks, 8 chapters, each documenting the gap between accessibility claims and actual infrastructure. Introduction, explaining methodology. Conclusion, synthesizing findings into recommendations for park services nationwide. Appendix with technical specifications for measuring trail grade, surface quality, obstacle frequency. She sent the outline to her editor at midnight. Got a response at 12:15. This is exactly what we need. Start writing. The next 3 weeks were discipline. Write in the morning, revise in the afternoon. Research in the evening. Grayson worked in the shop below. Wren did homework in the corner after school. Claire existed in the comfortable routine of people doing separate work in shared space, the rhythm they'd established over months now restored after the interruption of travel. On Tuesday, 2 weeks before departure, a package arrived addressed to Grayson. He opened it at the workbench while Claire was working on chapter outlines. Inside was a handwritten note and a check for $800. "What is it?" Claire asked. "Guy from Spokane, the one you told about my shop." Grayson held up the note. "He drove down, had me service his chair. Turns out the pull was from a frame weld that had fractured. Nobody else caught it because they weren't looking for structural damage. 800 seems high for a weld." "It's not for the weld. It's for the diagnostic. He says 3 other mechanics told him the pull was in his head, that he was pushing wrong, that he needed to build more strength." Grayson set down the note. "I found a hairline crack in the frame in under 10 minutes. He's paying me for not gaslighting him." Claire felt anger rise, familiar and specific. They told him it was his fault. Same thing they told you. Same thing they tell everyone whose equipment fails. Blame the operator instead of checking the machine. "What did you tell him?" "That his equipment was broken and it wasn't his fault and I'd fix it." "Then I fixed it. Just like you did for me. Just like I did for you." Grayson folded the check, put it in his pocket. He's sending his partner too. Power chair user. Having issues with motor controller. I told him I'd learn power chair systems if he didn't mind being a test case. You're expanding into power chairs. Why not disability equipment is disability equipment? If I can learn combustion engines, I can learn electric motors. Claire looked at him, at the shop around him, at the organized tools and careful notation. You're building something. I'm fixing things that need fixing. Same as always. No, this is different. This is building towards something bigger. Echo. Grayson was silent for a moment. Maybe. We'll see. The week before Claire left, Wren announced she wanted to make a going-away present. She disappeared into her room after school for 3 days and emerged with a hand-drawn map of the United States showing all 8 parks Claire would visit, each one marked with a star and a constellation name. Yellowstone was Ursa Major. Yosemite was Orion. The Grand Canyon was Cassiopeia. "So you can navigate by stars if you get lost," Wren explained seriously. "I don't think that's how GPS works. GPS breaks. Stars don't. Dad told me." Claire looked at Grayson, who shrugged. Backup navigation's never a bad idea. She hung the map in the room that night next to the painting of the garage her mother had made 30 years ago. 2 maps, different scales, both showing places where important work happened, where people built things that lasted. The morning of May 3rd arrived cold and clear. Claire packed the car with equipment, camping gear, laptop, camera, first aid kit, toolkit, spare parts, 5 days of food that didn't require refrigeration. The chair went last, secured carefully in the passenger seat where she could see it. Grayson and Wren came down to see her off. Wren hugged her fiercely. "Take pictures of everything." "I will. And call when you get somewhere with cell service." "I'll call. And come back safe." "I'll do my best." Wren stepped back. Grayson handed Claire a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Don't open it until you're at the first park." "What is it?" "You'll see. Just wait." Claire put the package in the glove compartment, looked at Grayson, at Wren, at the garage that had become the center of a life she'd built in the margins. "I'll be back in 6 weeks." "I know. The room will be here." "So will Tuesday." "So will Tuesday." Claire got in the car, started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, looked in the rearview mirror and saw Grayson and Wren standing in front of the garage, both of them waving. She waved back, then focused on the road ahead. Yellowstone was 12 hours northeast. She made it in 13, stopping twice to check the chair's bearings and once for gas and coffee. Arrived at the park entrance at dusk, paid the entrance fee, drove to the accessible campground that had been reserved for weeks. The campsite was paved level, equipped with an accessible picnic table and fire ring. The bathroom was 200 yards away, with a graded path and automatic doors. Everything exactly as promised. Claire set up her tent on the platform, provided, transferred inside, arranged her equipment with the precision Grayson had taught her through observation. Then she remembered the package, unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, hinged with her initials carved into the lid. The box was made from cherry, the same wood Grayson had used for the paint case he'd built months ago. The same wood his father had saved for 20 years for the right project. Claire opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a compass. Not a cheap camping compass, but a precision instrument, brass and glass. Engraved on the back in Grayson's careful block print, "For finding your way back, always." G. She sat in her tent holding the compass and felt something break open in her chest. Not sad, something more complicated. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition that someone who fixed things for a living had just given her the tools to navigate territory nobody had mapped accurately. The compass was practical. The box was art. Together they were promised that wherever she went, however far she traveled, she had a way to measure direction and a reminder of where home was. Claire set the compass on the box and took a photo. Sent it to Grayson with a message. "Open the package. It's perfect. Thank you." The reply came 3 minutes later. "You're welcome. Document everything. Come back safe." She would. She'd document every trail, every barrier, every gap between accessibility claims and actual infrastructure. She'd build a record that was harder to ignore than individual complaints. She'd prove that wilderness was accessible if the people in charge of wilderness decided to make it so. The next 6 weeks passed in a rhythm of documentation and discovery. Claire pushed her chair over trails that claimed accessibility but delivered obstacles. Photographed ramps too steep for safe use. Measured grade percentages that exceeded ADA standards by margins that made compliance meaningless. Called park services from parking lots and asked why their accessible trail had a 6-inch curb at the trailhead. Got answers that ranged from defensive to apologetic to genuinely surprised. She also found trails that worked, paths that had been designed with actual wheelchair users consulted, infrastructure that recognized accessibility as baseline rather than accommodation, parks where rangers knew the difference between compliance and function. She documented everything, the good, the bad, the gap between them, built a record with photographs and measurements and recorded conversations, sent updates to her editor weekly, called Grayson every few days to report equipment status and hear Wren's questions about geology and wildlife. By mid-June, she had 4 chapters drafted and 3 more outlined. The manuscript was taking shape as something angrier and more hopeful than she'd expected. Angry at the systems that failed, hopeful about the few that succeeded. On June 20th at a campground in Yosemite, Claire's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Morrison, this is Director Patterson from the National Park Service Accessibility Office. I've been reading your book." Claire sat up straighter. "Which book?" "Living Sideways. And I've been hearing about the research you're doing for the follow-up. I'd like to talk to you about consulting on a national accessibility audit we're planning." "You want me to consult? I want you to lead it. Full funding 2-year project, comprehensive review of accessibility infrastructure across all national parks. You'd have a team budget authority to make recommendations that actually get implemented." Claire was silent for a long moment. "Why me?" "Because you're documenting what we should have been measuring all along. Because you're not interested in inspiration narratives. Because you understand the difference between compliance and access." A pause. "And because every parks director I've called in the last month has mentioned your name. You're making noise we can't ignore. I need to think about it. Take a week. Call me back. This is real, Ms. Morrison. We're ready to actually fix things if you're ready to show us how." After they hung up, Claire sat in her tent, looking at the compass Grayson had given her. The needle pointed north. She was pointed somewhere else entirely, toward work that mattered, toward changing systems instead of just documenting their failures, toward building something bigger than a book. She called Grayson. "The Park Service wants to hire me. 2-year project leading a national accessibility audit." Silence on the line. Then, "That's big." "Yeah. What did you tell them?" "That I need to think about it." "What's there to think about?" "Whether I'm ready for something that big. Whether I can actually do it." "Claire," his voice was even, "you spent 6 weeks documenting infrastructure failures that everyone else ignored. You're doing it right now. This is just doing it with support instead of alone. It means 2 years. It means travel. It means doing the work you've been training for your whole career. It means changing things instead of just writing about them." A pause. "It means you don't come back." The last sentence hit harder than it should have. "I'd come back. Between trips." The room. "The room's yours whether you use it or not. I told you that." His voice was careful. "But this is different. This is a real job doing real work. You don't turn that down because you're worried about keeping a room in Idaho. It's not just the room. I know. He was silent for a moment. But you're going to say yes anyway, because it's the right thing to do. And you don't walk away from right things just because they're hard or they take you places you weren't planning to go. Claire sat with that. He was right. She was going to say yes. Had known it the moment Director Patterson made the offer. The rest was just fear talking. I'll need a base, somewhere to work between field trips, somewhere that isn't a hotel. You have a base. It's got a desk and a window and bad coffee downstairs. For 2 years, for however long you need it. Claire looked at the compass again. I'm going to say yes. Good. Document the hell out of those parks. Make them fix everything. I'll try. You'll succeed. You're too stubborn to fail. After they hung up, Claire sat for a long time watching the sun set over Yosemite Valley. She thought about the last year, about the chair that had been broken and the mechanic who'd fixed it, about the book tour and the research and the slow accumulation of evidence that the world was only as accessible as people chose to make it. She thought about Grayson teaching her to maintain her own equipment, about Wren drawing constellations to navigate by, about the room above a garage where she'd learned what home felt like after 6 years of temporary spaces. She picked up her phone and called Director Patterson back. I'll do it. 2 years full audit recommendations with teeth, but I have conditions. Name them. I want the audit findings made public. I want accessibility advocates consulted at every stage. I want the Park Service to commit to implementation timelines before the audit even starts. And I want it in writing that this isn't just documentation. This is commitment to actual change. Done. When can you start? Well, on August 1st. I need to finish my current research and deliver the manuscript first. August 1st. We'll have everything ready. Claire ended the call and sat in the gathering darkness, feeling the weight of what she'd just committed to. 2 years. Real funding. Authority to actually change things instead of just documenting failure. It terrified her. It also felt exactly right. She finished the park's research in early July, drove back to Idaho with a manuscript that was 90% complete and evidence that the Park Service was starting to listen. Pulled into the garage parking lot on July 8th at 3 in the afternoon and found Grayson under a car doing an oil change. He rolled out when he heard her, stood up, wiped his hands. You're early. Finished faster than expected. How'd it go? Got everything I needed, plus a job offer I accepted. Something shifted in his face. Good. That's good. Room still available. Always. Claire went upstairs and found everything exactly as she'd left it. Painting on the wall, books on the shelf, coffee in the cabinet. The map Wren had drawn still hung next to her mother's painting of the garage. She unpacked, showered, changed into clean clothes. Went back downstairs and found Grayson finishing with the oil change customer. When the customer left, he turned to her. 2 years is a long time. It is. You'll be gone most of it. Probably. But you'll come back between trips. That's the plan. Claire looked around the shop. This is home now. I don't have anywhere else I'd rather be between doing the work. Grayson nodded slowly. Wren's going to want to hear about every park. I've got 6 weeks of stories and about 300 photos. Better pace yourself. She's got questions. I'd be disappointed if she didn't. That evening, Claire had dinner with Grayson and Wren in the apartment above the garage, told them about the trails and the failures and the few places that got it right, showed Wren photographs of geysers and canyons and granite faces, answered questions about bear safety and trail grades, and whether wheelchair users could actually access wilderness without paved paths. Some can, Claire said, with the right equipment and the right trails. That's what the audit's going to measure. What's actually possible versus what's being claimed. Are you going to make them fix everything? Wren asked. I'm going to make them commit to fixing everything. Then I'm going to hold them accountable when they don't. After Wren went to bed, Claire and Grayson sat on the couch in the living room. He was reading something technical. She was reviewing notes for the manuscript. They worked in comfortable silence until Grayson set down his book. You didn't have to come back here. You could have set up anywhere. I know, but I didn't want anywhere. I wanted here. Why? Claire thought about how to explain it. Because this is the place where I stopped accepting broken as normal, where I learned the difference between my body's limitations and infrastructure's failures, where someone fixed my chair and accidentally fixed my understanding of what was actually wrong. She looked at him directly. You gave me my life back, Grayson. Not the same life I had before. Something better. Something that knows how to push back against systems instead of accepting them. I just fixed your chair. You fixed my chair correctly. After 7 people did it wrong or refused to try. That mattered more than you know. Grayson was silent for a long moment. You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe, but it would have taken longer and hurt more. And I might not have had the energy left to write the book or do the tour or take the park service job. She paused. You gave me time. Time I didn't know I needed. Time that turned into everything that came after. So you're saying thank you. I'm saying home. This place, this room you and Ren in Tuesday afternoons. That's home now, and I'll keep coming back to it no matter how far the work takes me. Grayson looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he did something she'd never seen him do. He reached over and took her hand, held it for a long moment, squeezed once. Welcome home, he said. Then he let go and picked up his book and went back to reading like nothing had happened. But something had. An understanding that the space between them had shifted from friendship to something deeper. Not romantic exactly, but essential. The bone-deep recognition of 2 people who'd fixed each other's most important things without meaning to. Claire spent the next 3 weeks finishing the manuscript, sent it to her editor on July 28th, got a call back the same day. This is going to change things. I mean, actually change them. The Park Service is going to hate you. They're already hiring me. They know what's coming. Then they're braver than I thought, or stupider. Either way, this book's going to be massive. The manuscript was scheduled for October publication. The Park Service audit started August 1st. Claire would spend the next 2 years traveling to parks across the country, measuring infrastructure, building documentation that would force change whether the systems wanted it or not. But first she had one more Tuesday. August 1st fell on a Tuesday. Claire went downstairs at 2 p.m. and found Grayson at his workbench working on a transmission. She transferred to her usual stool, opened her laptop, started reviewing the audit protocols the Park Service had sent. Grayson made coffee. It was still bad. She drank it anyway. Ren arrived at 5:30 with questions about whether Claire would see grizzly bears in Glacier National Park. Claire showed her photographs from Yellowstone and explained bear safety protocols. Ren took notes like she was preparing a dissertation. At 6:30, Grayson started cleaning up. Claire closed her laptop. When do you leave? He asked. Thursday. First audit site is Acadia. 4 weeks of measuring trails and interviewing staff. Your chair ready? You serviced it last week. It's ready. I mean, are you ready to do this work for 2 years? Claire thought about the question, about the compass he'd given her, and the room that would always be hers, and the understanding that home was a place you could leave and return to without losing it. Yeah, I'm ready. Good. He handed her a small envelope. For the road. Inside was a laminated card with emergency contact numbers for wheelchair repair specialists in every state she'd be visiting. Each one carefully researched, each one vetted by Grayson personally. Just in case, he said. Thank you. You're welcome. He looked at her steadily. Come back safe. Come back when you can. The room's here. Tuesday's here. We're here. I know. Claire left on Thursday with her chair precisely maintained and her equipment carefully packed, and the knowledge that she was leaving home to go do the most important work of her career. She'd measure trails and document failures and build evidence that would force change in systems that had resisted it for decades. She'd spend 2 years proving that accessibility wasn't accommodation, but right. That wilderness belonged to everyone. That infrastructure could be fixed if people decided fixing mattered more than preserving barriers. And when the work was done, when the audit was complete, and the recommendations were published and the Park Service was committed to actual change, she'd come back to Idaho. Back to a room above a garage. Back to a mechanic who taught her that broken wasn't permanent and accepting it was a choice. Back to the place where she'd learned that the world was exactly as accessible as people chose to make it. Back home. The compass Grayson had given her sat on the dashboard needle pointing north. Claire didn't need it to find her way. She knew exactly where she was going and exactly where she'd return to when the journey was done. Some things broke. Some things could be fixed. And some things like finding home in a garage in Idaho with a man who fixed wheelchairs and a 9-year-old who asked impossible questions, some things were already exactly right.